Great. Welcome, everyone. I'm so glad you made it. I got bored a few weeks ago and wanted to learn more things about swords than I could stumble into my own. So I figured I'd ask the known world to teach me about swords. And then I'd, pull in some laurels to give some feedback so that we can get even better about teaching people about swords. So we have 7 presenters lined up for today. One of them I know couldn't make it in person, but sent a video that I will try and screen share, and we'll see how well that goes. The format of this is each presenter is going to have 10 minutes to talk about whatever they want to talk about. Hopefully swords are involved. And then after that, we have 4 laurels who have graciously volunteered their time to do a little bit of Q&A and give some feedback about how well this can fit into an SCA context. Not all of these laurels are necessarily martial laurels, but they are, as laurels, experts in how to present these things and fit it into what we like to do as a society. If I could, in fact, have my 4 laurels give a quick intro of who they are, what they specialize in, and, I don't know, a cool sword fact they know, that would be dandy.
Why don't you call it in order, Eric?
Cool. Valentin, would you like to go first? You're muted.
You're muted.
Technology, isn't it lovely?
Yeah.
Good morning. I'm Valentin Malatesta in North Shield. If it's historical combat, I love it. And I'm mostly focused around things from Italy, late 14th to early 17th century.
Great. Thank you. Lissa, if I could have you go next.
Sure. Hi, I'm Lissa. I'm from the East. I'm currently the Minister of Arts and Sciences of the East, and I've done a lot with A&S rubrics and competition. I am not a martial arts laurel. I started out playing around with martial arts, but then got sidetracked. Now I'm back, and there are a couple people on this call who are teaching me. One of you is my apprentice, and it's all very cool, and I'm glad there's a nice community around it. But hopefully I can give you some feedback about how to bring this into the more formal A&S, especially competition setting.
Great, thank you. Aaron, I'm gonna have you go next.
Sure thing. I'm Aaron Harper. Onsteora doesn't ever claim why they give a laurel, so you don't get a laurel for a thing, but it's generally accepted that it was either harp making or martial arts, probably martial arts. I was also the premier society deputy A&S minister for historical combat, so I wrote the rules that allow the A&S community to play with martial arts. So yeah, been doing that for a while. Italian, Northern Italian swordplay, including the Bolognese school and the rapier context are my specialties, but yeah, I also read the Spanish, I read the German, etc.
Great, thank you. And then, hold on for a second. Logos, if we can have you wrap up the laurel panel.
Hi, I'm Logos from the middle. My specialty is Northern Italian rapier, specifically Fabris, but I've read them all. And I've dabbled in everything, German, Spanish, Bolognese, God help me, even silver. So.
Great. Well, thank you. So, how do I, cool. So we're gonna have each person give 10 minutes, and then Laurel's gonna give 10 minutes, and then at the end, if people wanna hang around, we're gonna open up to the populace and have the populace ask any questions of our presenters that they thought of along the way. So I'm gonna read the order out now, just to get everyone on the same page. So we're gonna have Ishmael going first, Elsie going second, Daroga going third, Ogata going fourth. Ogata sent me a video I'm going to screen share. Miguel's gonna go fifth, Remy's going sixth, and then Killian is going to go 7th. So with that said, I'm going to, if I pin this, does everyone see Ishmael? See pin for everyone?
Not yet. There he
No.
is.
Yeah. Once I start talking, speaker view should throw me.
No. Let's see if I can spotlight use him. Did that
Yeah, that worked.
Great. Cool.
Okay.
Wonderful. So, talk about swords.
Okay. So if you have not yet met me, my name is Ishmael Steadfast Reed. I'm a provost of the Atlantean Academy d'Espé and a member of the Order of the White Scarves. And I want to focus today on something that I think is really interesting and important about Vienna Anonymous. That text came out a couple years ago now, I think. And I was reading through it again during our plague times and found some really interesting nuances that I think have a lot of really important effects on the way that we teach students, specifically about blade coverage and blade constraint. And I think that some of the nuances in Vienna Anonymous actually point at some of the places where our new and intermediate fencers are often making errors that we have to unteach. So I kind of want to go through why I think that's the case and make an argument for a kind of internal paradigm of blade constraint. So to start, normally speaking, we think about covering your opponent's sword, constraining your opponent's sword when we are teaching that concept as you are covering the line that your opponent is most likely to attack you in. We use phrases like forcing your opponent to have to change lines or preventing your opponent from being able to strike you in that line. And I know that oftentimes that demonstration is done with blade contact, showing how if your opponent were to extend their sword, how their sword would get pushed offline by the structure that you've created with your defense, with your guard. I think that one of the things that we don't convey as clearly as we could is the difference between what Vienna Anonymous lays out as the difference between simple engagement and shutting out. And so I want to talk about those two terms and how I think they're applied differently. So we talk a lot in the, as we start to move into intermediate and proficient fencing, of removing blade contact when we are covering our opponent's sword, when we are forming counter guards. We want to try to avoid that blade on blade contact. Capifero says the same. He says, it is only necessary that I stringer the débellé of my enemy's sword in a straight line with the forte of mine, and this straddling it without touching. Vienna Anonymous provides a really useful term for this, which is the simple engagement. Vienna Anonymous describes this as it's always done in a straight line towards your opponent's body while covering yourself from his sword with yours. But the key that is added in Vienna Anonymous that I think is missing from some of our instruction is, even though the line from his point to your body is not wholly covered, you have this advantage, that he cannot strike you without passing through your forte. And this is a quote from Fabris. Fabris does mention this point of the purpose of the engagement, the purpose of covering your opponent's sword. It is not to make it impossible for your opponent to strike you. It is making it unwise for your opponent to attempt to strike you. And I think that distinction of that, it isn't that your opponent's point cannot extend toward your body. It is that if your opponent's point were to extend towards your body, they would have to pass through your forte, and you would easily be able to extend your arm and strike them. I think that focusing on that difference from the very beginning would help to prevent us from having to unteach blade contact later. And also, I think that it will make it even more apparent what Vienna Anonymous teaches of there being actually two different levels of constraint. The first one being this kind of simple engagement, what we normally teach as covering or finding your opponent's sword. In multiple texts, in Capifero, in Fabris, and again in Vienna Anonymous, the description is always of the débellé of your opponent's sword having to pass through your forte, And, Capaferro says, even if the line between your opponent and you is not wholly covered, he says, quote, as the danger of the blow approaches, in an instant it can be covered. And so all of these quotes kind of add to this idea of this simple engagement of finding the sword as really being about making it unwise for your opponent to extend toward you, not impossible. And that distinction, I think, will, if we make it early and we make it often, I think will go a long way towards preventing some of the things we often have to wind up unteaching, like undue blade contact, too much blade pressure between blades, because I think that oftentimes we are conflating this simple engagement with what I want to talk about next, which is how Vienna Anonymous defines the term shutting out. Shutting out. It is, by definition, the way that Vienna Anonymous describes it, it's removing your opponent's point from your presence, which I feel like when we are teaching controlling your opponent's sword and blade work, oftentimes we wind up teaching that level 1 constraint of like finding your opponent's sword as if its objective is shutting out. That is, we teach this finding of the opponent's sword as if the purpose is to remove the opponent's point from your presence. At least, even if that's not what we say, that is often the takeaway. Vienna Anonymous says, gaining and simultaneously shutting out his sword is done when his sword is on an oblique line, or when his point is out of your presence, or also, and I think this is a really important clause, or also when you can bring your body out of his sword's presence. Capaferro goes on and says, one dominates the sword in 2 manners. In the first, when having acquired the adversary's sword to never quit the domination while striking. But he also includes in that same paragraph, in the tempo in which the opponent's sword travels by force, it is understood to be in my domination. And so I think that there's kind of this implication, even back in Capaferro, before we get Vienna Anonymous's commentary, that there are kind of 2 different levels of constraining your opponent's sword. Level 1 is that it is unwise for your opponent to extend their sword. And level 2 is it is impossible for their opponent to strike you in that line. And you are forcing them to take a tempo to change lines. And the reason why I want to make the argument that I think that the paradigm ought to be, there are these 2 levels of constraint. It is unwise for your opponent to attack, and it is impossible for your opponent to attack, is because of the way that you respond to each of those levels of constraint. In Vienna Anonymous, multiple places, angles are described. That is, creating an angle between your body and your opponent's sword. That is, moving your body out of your opponent's presence. I can provide you with a couple quotes from both Capaferro and also Vienna Anonymous. Capaferro says, neither less must he go to strike if he is not secure to parry the response, nor fail to void his body if he does not strike. This, to me, fits with the idea that shutting out your opponent, that level 2 constraint, can either be removing their point from your body or removing your body from their point. Capaferro goes on to say, oftentimes when you are controlling your opponent's sword, you will put the point of your sword opposite his hand in a straight line, leaning your body somewhat to the rear. We teach this body lean for that same reason. Capaferro describes even what you should do with your head in order to shut your opponent's point out. In striking, care will be taken that the head will be somewhat more to one side than the other, according to whether one will strike to the inside or outside, so that it will be covered by the hilt and the sword arm. Vienna Anonymous adds to this, bend your body together with your head on one side or the other. And this is how I want to conclude, is that when we are currently teaching constraining your opponent's blade, I feel like these 2 purposes, making it unwise to continue extending towards your opponent, making it impossible, get mixed up together, and we wind up with a couple negative outcomes. The first outcome is undue blade pressure and presence from new and intermediate fencers who are using just their arms' posture to attempt to remove their opponent's point from their presence. And so they wind up pushing. The second reason why we see all this blade contact and pressure is that level 1, that simple engagement, is a lot of what you create with the structure of your arm and the blade, and not necessarily what you're doing with also leaning your body, that simple engagement. And so I think what winds up happening is new and intermediate fencers are using just their arm strength, because everything in that level 1, that simple engagement, is describing where your blade and your arm are lined up to cover a portion of your body. And so I feel like if we start to introduce this idea of level 1 constraint is simple engagement, level 2 constraint is shutting out, and they have different purposes and are created in a different way, you'll start to see new and intermediate fencers be less likely to use blade contact, because they understand that the purpose of level 1, that simple finding of the sword, is not to push your opponent's point out of your presence. 2, we'll see less pushing and less blade contact, because level 2 constraint we can teach as being a combination of body leaning and angulation in order to remove your body from your opponent's presence. And that way we won't see students relying on their sword arm in order to push their opponent's point away from them. They can instead position their body such that they're removing themselves from their opponent's presence. And so this idea, I think, is really important to getting ahead of some of the mistaken conclusions that students are coming to, and also really helpful for us strategically to understand conceptually why it is okay to avoid blade contact in the first instance, and why it is okay to continue working on what your body is doing as well as what your sword is doing in the second case. And so I think that is that's where I'll end.
Great. Well, thank you so much, Ishmael. I'm going to leave the spotlight on you. I'm going to open it up to the Laurels.
Sure.
Ishmael, question for you.
Yes.
I agree, and we could have a much longer talk about why he suggests these things, but that's not the point of your presentation. If you don't touch their blade, how do you move their point out of presence? You gave 2 options for getting the point out of presence. Your body is one of them. Mm-hmm. Moving their blade is the other one. So if you're not touching their sword, how are you moving their point out of presence?
Even if you aren't touching their blade, which none of these masters suggest to do, you can still be moving their point out of presence by either invitations is one place where you can do that, is you can provide something that appears to be on target but actually is not. You can also move their point out of presence by creating a guard that disinclines them to, I guess that's not actually true, is it?
They're gonna probably point at you.
Yeah, but
I see 2 answers, so
okay.
I'll give you that hint.
So, like, my instinct is to move my body such that I am behind my sword, but I think that increasing the angulation of the counter guard that you're offering could potentially remove the opponent's point from presence without having to push their sword out of the way. I guess those are the 2 that I would do, is either change the angle of the guard that you're presenting, or change the angle that your body is taking towards their point.
Possibly. I still see, thinking through all my SCA fights, people still want to aim at you. Mm-hmm. So I guess my thing would be, very few people don't care about aiming at you. So there's those who will just offer it up and point past you. But the other one is, I would remind you about working in micro tempos. Okay. So someone's point will leave your presence when you have made them shift, when you have made them cavatione, when you made them something else.
Oh, yes.
So if you think of it that way, the only way to get them to move their point is kind of invitation, but it's more along the lines of you've made them have to do something injudiciously. Mm-hmm. So all that to just say that it is possible, but you'll have to be careful about telling people that to move someone's point, because then they'll start engaging again. Mm-hmm. So that's all. Otherwise,
that's great. Yeah, thank you.
Yeah, I agree.
Okay, so again, I also agree. I disagree with Tom on this one about that the Vienna Anonymous is the first one to make that distinction, because Fabris clearly makes it in several places about the distinction between, but he calls it a counter guard versus finding.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so a counter guard is done to just close the line without any contact. Okay,
Mm-hmm.
so when I am engaging, whether I don't make blade contact, which Fabris and the Vienna Anonymous and Capoferro and Alfieri all state that you do not want blade contact when you're finding. Do I ever have blade contact?
I have found useful purposes for blade contact, yes. So I don't want to say never.
Right. Okay. So, yeah. So when I teach, I try to make the distinction for people between the defensive angle and the offensive angles. And the defensive angle is centered upon me working outward. The offensive angle is centered upon my opponent. Once I have struck my opponent, it is perfectly fine. As a matter of fact, it is advisable to make as much blade contact as you can to make sure that blade is getting nowhere near you as you are killing them and they don't know they've been killed.
Yeah.
So a quick question, just sort of thinking larger and in terms of the SCA. What is it that you might want to do with this type of presentation? Is this something that you're going to use for teaching, something that you would like to bring to others, share at a competition, that sort of thing?
I think my goal, or how I imagine this idea best being used, is teaching the teachers. I think that like the exceptional laurels in this panel, I know I've worked with Aaron. Aaron is my primary teacher and has made that distinction multiple times and has really helped to clarify why blade contact doesn't happen in some instances and why it might happen in others. But I think that the kind of common melting pot Italian-ish SCA rapier often teaches controlling your opponent's sword as basically using your arm and your sword to push on their point. And so I think that the goal that I would have is trying to offer a mental framework for how you can teach new and intermediate fencers these different purposes in a way that is that avoids those outcomes, basically. So yeah, I think it's teaching the teachers as much as being an interesting framework for me.
Okay. In that case, I think a lot of what you have is good because you will be speaking to people who know the general ideas. One thing you might want to do, which I like that you just did now, is sort of set a baseline for what do we teach in the SCA. I mean, that's a hard thing to begin with because I wasn't even taught, finding until I started doing these sort of things. But just kind of letting us know what you're assuming people are taught a little bit more clearly, and then talking about that difference. I'm also always a proponent, if you wanted to take this to a more formal, longer class, of things like a visual, an outline, and then for the quotes especially, allowing people to see the quotes is just going to help my ability to kind of process what you're saying. So some of those things, if you want to pick it up to the next level, to do something like teach an online class.
Right. Okay. Yeah. Thank you.
I would even say, I would add to that and say, because I did this in my drill manual, give the quotes, but also paraphrase the quotes in your own words, because sometimes the quotes get a little crazy.
Accurate. Okay.
So I've got two nuances to add, unless my friend from Northshield wants to add his bullet points first.
I don't have anything specific to say other than this is a really interesting distinction that I think doesn't get taught enough in the SCA. I've seen it more in Western martial arts groups, especially in the Chicago Swordplay Guild. And I'm really excited to see more people focusing on these little nuanced details that can make all the difference. And I think really having that solid structural understanding is something that will benefit us greatly in the SCA. So kudos.
So yeah, to add to that, my last point will be, I'll add to what Logos said. You can also make contact as a feint, but you will only want to really teach this to intermediate and higher level. So if I want you to move your sword I might contact your sword and just kind of glide on it slightly, because your automatic reaction is going to be to try and parry that slide once you start feeling it. So you can make contact as a feint. Something that you do want to teach from the bottom up, though, is the goal in the Vienna Anonymous is to get your forte as close to their point, or in line, as close to the line coming from their point as you can. Because his entire thing is, I want to get my point closer to my target than their forte is to my point, right? So that's one thing. That's one way to teach this is, like you said, you're closing out the line, but the point there is not just that I'm hovering over their blade. The point there is I'm making my forte interrupt that line faster than he can hit me when he's going forward. I think that's a good way to start teaching a nuance of forte versus débole.
Yeah, and I think that that brings up a good point. That's something that I could emphasize, is that first level of engagement, it relies on the defensive partner responding. Like, you do actually have to extend your arm in order to close out that line as your opponent attempts to advance. The whole point is that you are making it such that the tempo is trivial for you.
Right.
And so that kind of difference of that first level engagement is preparing for an active response on your part. It's not a passive exercise.
Right. Yep. Good.
Thank you all.
Great. Wonderful. So thank you all so much. I'm going to unspotlight you. So next up, we're going to be exiting Italy, and we're going to look at something that we don't see as often in the SCA. Elsie, I'm going to hand it over to you now. That's spotlighted. Everyone, yeah.
Perfect. Let's see if I'm set up where I can screen share for you guys. Is it possible to set me up for screen sharing? Raphael, is it possible to set me up for screen sharing?
Give me, if you hit, so you're spotlighted, if you hit the share screen button, that's my best guess.
Host disabled participant screen sharing.
Yeah, host, if you should have a little baby arrow next to share screen, Raphael,
yeah.
And it should pop up an option that says allow participants to share.
Okay, see if it works now.
Hey, yes. That looks better. I'll do that.
Did it give you the option? There we go.
Set that up. Perfect. So we're moving all the way from Naples, apparently.
You're coming in a little choppy.
And thank you guys for letting me come along and talk a little bit of the horsey side of HEMA with you all. My name is Elsie Horner-Polk. I'm from the West Kingdom. And this is my research partner, because we all know it's difficult to do martial arts research without a partner. This is as far as chocolate mousse on the.
Uh-oh. Well, that's fun.
Lost.
Cool. Well, while we're dealing with that, let's go to the next person, and hopefully they'll come back. They have a presentation on Rossfechten, so like horseback fighting, the German tradition, and that sounds really cool, and I want to learn about it. But oh, technology. In the meantime, hey, Daroga, you're up.
Okay, well, I'm going to try to share my screen and hope it comes out just a little bit better this time around. So let's give it a shot. I've worked with a lot of Zoom, so I'm hoping that this is going to work. Can you guys see that?
Yep.
Okay.
Yes.
Okay.
Yes.
Let me start the slide now from the beginning and let's see whether this kicks in. Okay, can everybody still see the full screen of the slide, correct?
Yes.
Yes.
Yay. Hello, I am Don DeRoga Veronin of the East Kingdom and also a member of the Order of Golden Rapier as well as the Order of the March. I'm discussing today how one of the authors of this style of Spanish fencing, called La Verdadera Destreza, or as I will refer to it, LVD, wrote about how to fight a certain style of weapon. My goals today are introduce the author, discuss the cultural reasons he might be writing about this, give an interpretation and explanation of the techniques themselves, and lastly, to talk about what I plan to look into in the future. Going into the author. The author is Luis Pacheco de Navarez. Pacheco is one of the most prolific authors on LVD. This book was written in 1599 and is only the second book that was ever written on LVD, after the one by the founder Jaime Carranza in 1569, which was actually published in 1582. I'm only looking at a small portion of this book, 9 pages or 6 plates, where Pacheco discusses how to fight someone with a curved blade that he calls the alfanje. This over here is a perfect example of it. This is the Mediterranean saber, and based on the picture he provides and how other authors describe it, is most probably what we call a falchion, but we're not sure. The person he describes as wielding the weapon is referred to as a Turk or a Moor, and he uses these terms interchangeably. And there is a lot of baggage with him doing this, and I will bring that up shortly. The reason behind him writing about this technique has layers. There seems to be a fear in Christian Spain of either reinvasion by Muslims or rebellion by those that are still living there. Spain, as we know it today, had taken back the Iberian Peninsula in 1492 after several hundred years of fighting against primarily Muslims. This is only about 100 years before this book was actually written. Second, as late as 1571, Spain was still fighting the Ottoman Empire for control of the Mediterranean. The founder of this style, Carranza, actually participated in the suppression of a Morisco revolt, according to his own writings. The Moriscos were actually Muslims that were converted to Christianity, which goes back to the fear. And lastly, Pacheco claims to have fought the Turk before and has personal experience against this. Quote, I know and can attest from the experience of having confronted them in battle, both in their land and ours. Pacheco claims, talking about the response, that the opponent is successful in wielding this weapon, quote, due to the inconsideration and little wit of our men than for what they are capable. He's saying that the opponent wasn't successful due to the skill or due to their skill or technique, but due to the Christian lack of knowledge. And of course, Pacheco is taking it on himself to educate people with his book. He goes on to say that while the weapon might seem scary, the limitations are many. He claims they have only a single downward attack. They never attempt a first attempt attack and only wait. They primarily attempt to strike the diestro's blade first, and they have no thrust and lack blade length compared to the Spanish sword, being about a quarter shorter than the Spanish blade. I'll go into the actual techniques themselves in the next couple of slides, but to summarize Pacheco, almost every one of his 6 responses can be broken down into stay far enough away, or know your range, or what they call their medium, feint, or use what he refers to as an acometimiento, free the blade, or disengage, and counter after time, or after the attack. He addresses other potential opponent responses, but he maintains that his techniques are universal and based off of Carranza, and you can continue to use them again and again, regardless of how many times the opponent attempts to cut, as they flow together and you can repeat them. Here I'm going to start talking about the plates. Here we'll cover briefly the techniques and the plates he uses. Each of his plates uses a different diagram, but the plate on the left here actually contains all of the stepping points that he uses, and I will be referencing them here. The first plate, the one with acometimiento from point A to D, can be a technique on its own if the opponent does nothing, but it is also the start of all of the other 5 plates, as it is intended to be the feint that triggers the opponent's downward cut. And it's simply a step forward to within a range where you can lean forward and actually stab the person. This one has the diestro stepping on a straight line forward from A to D and thrusting at the opponent. The second plate, when he lowers his alfanje, shorten your sword, set it free, and injure him straight. You execute your acometimiento or thrust. The opponent cuts down. You free your blade and step to E, so from D to E, on one of the sharper angles here and thrust, while being cautious for what the opponent might do next, which he happens to cover in the next few plates. The third plate is actually, hold on a second. The third plate is exactly like the second, but you step further out from D to F and thrust. He spends a little bit more time going into how you might be scared at being so close to your opponent in the previous technique, but you shouldn't be, as his response. And really you can perform everything from E, but if you needed some more distance, you can step to F. The fourth plate, when he lowers his alfanje, injure him with a tajo. The fourth plate has you start by executing the same movements as the previous. Feint to D, he cuts down, you set your blade free, but instead of thrusting, you step even farther out to H and execute a tajo, or cut that comes from your right side. He goes into some bit here bragging about Carranza and how the tajo is universal. Pacheco's book is from 1599, when Pacheco was really a fan of Carranza and saying how great he was. In his later books, when he was trying to make a name for himself, he would try and insult him instead and downplay his fencing innovations. The fifth plate, if not having got the blade with the first move, he wished to arabatar, injure him with a thrust. Fifth plate begins in the familiar acometimiento. He cuts, you free the blade, and like 2, you step to E and injure him with a thrust. But he then comes back up with an arabatar, which is an upward cut to your sword. You step out to the other side, or an L, and thrust him from that position. He does say that you can repeat this process and keep moving to E, to F, to H, repeating the moves, freeing your blade and stabbing him as long as you keep your range. Lastly, the sixth plate begins as 5 did. Feint, he cuts down, you free the blade and step to E and stab him. He then executes an arabatar similar to 5, but instead you decide to step to P on the other side, on the diestro's left, and execute a revés, a reverse cut to his head, which comes from the diestro's left-hand side. Those are the 6 plates. I found, hold on, going back up on, I found from my own experience practicing these moves that they do build on each other and flow together nicely. I've not done them against resistance because of the pandemic. And I am left with some questions in regards to their use, to their specific use against a curved blade. My next steps. The big question I want to investigate is, and will be, is what he wrote actually valid? Was this written to sound impressive, or was it an actual threat? Some evidence points that he might have been writing it to gain social prestige in the royal courts, rather than being practical. Some of the writings of Pacheco's social enemies at the time accuse him of doing just that. Racism. He used the term Moor and Turk to mean the same thing, and they are actually not the same culturally, but he groups them together as a single other. Moors were Muslim inhabitants of the Iberian Peninsula and were from a certain area, originally Morocco. Turks were supposedly from the Ottoman Empire. This generalization raises questions about his understanding of the enemy. The weapon. What type of weapon did the opponent actually use? It looks like a falchion, but other Mediterranean and Middle Eastern weapons have curved blades, like the shamshir, and they might also have been used in period, and again, he is grouping them together. Lastly, technique. His opponent has only one downward swinging strike, other than the arabatar. I want to look into the cultural fighting styles that use the curved blade in this period to see if it was true, as it really undervalues the enemy and goes back to him possibly trying to sound impressive rather than having true content. Also related to technique, I've been taking Destreza lessons with David Rawlings of the London Longsword Academy, and we've been delving into Pacheco's response to the vulgar fencer, particularly the Italians. A light bulb went off in my head when I realized that we were going over almost the exact same series of techniques that Pacheco writes about in these plays. To add a bit of further evidence to this thought, Louis de Viedma, another period author, wrote briefly about Pacheco's techniques used to fight the Moor and said, quote, "The diestro may consider that it is almost the same that has been learned against the vulgar." Unquote. This adds an additional avenue of investigation to determine how similar those are and if Pacheco is really just repackaging the same techniques. In summary, I'm super excited by this material. It's such a small passage. There's so much to look into in terms of technique, as well as the cultural exploration and the history of Spain, their opponents, the politics, the weapons they used, the time period, and the lives of the people that lived there.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Taruga. I'm going to throw it over to the laurels now.
So I'm happy to start again. Oh, go ahead, Logos.
Okay, so
I'm going to take notes, by the way. So
what do you think about his blending of the Turks and the Moors all into a single threat? I can see it both ways, having studied quite a bit about, Siege of Malta, Battle of Lepanto, the Catholic League versus the Turks, et cetera, et cetera. So what are your thoughts on that?
I need to research it a little bit more because the racism and how you have to question as to whether he's grouping everybody as an other as a vulgar anyway, again, similar to how these techniques are similar to his other approach, or whether he's actually specific racism that's going against and grouping these two together. I don't know if there are differences in their fighting styles between the Turk and the Moor. I need to look into it more. I think it is, Pacheco insults and talks crap about everybody. Let's just be honest.
Yes, he does.
So if he's talking crap about the Moor and he's talking crap about the Turk, he's talking crap about the Italian, he's talking crap about the Spanish. So really, is it racism or does he just hate everybody?
I tend to agree with you that he hates everybody.
He does. He does. But it doesn't mean it's not valid. And again, he's grouping everybody together. And this is a wonderful technique. It's going to be perfect against everybody. Is he talking about the falchion? Is he talking about the shamshir? Again, there's a lot of generalization into this. And I think anything's possible, but I think his hatred is the commonality.
So yeah, this is Aaron. So you've hit on what my first question was, which is, yeah, he seems to have little regard for the Turks. There are plenty of Muslim fighting manuals that show far more techniques than just a downward blow. So, and also just looking at his own illustrations.
I would love to find those sources from you, by the way. I would actually be very interested in that.
I'll see if I can dig some of those up. The falchion, the curved blade that he shows, has points. So therefore, clearly there was thrusting. And I have a German saber from 1600. It's got a point. You can thrust with it, right? So my first question, which you also have been asking yourself, is how much do you trust him? His entire first book not his first book, his book where he breaks out all the other fencing masters, it's just one long diss for every single one of them, right? So yeah, I question that too. But my second question to you, and I have a few answers, but I want to hear your thoughts first. Where are you going to go to find some of the questions or find answers to some of the questions that you're looking for?
I'm already looking at a few different locations, specifically to the Italian question. I'm looking into his Pacheco's response against the vulgars to see whether there's commonalities between this and that. I am looking at the history of Spain and really in terms of that, in terms of looking at I've been talking to some of the experts in the field. A perfect example is after I did this the first time when I started looking into it, I actually got a response from Manuel Veli Ortiz saying, hey, by the way, there's really a question as to whether Carranza was really fought in the Morisco revolts himself, because he says it in one of his books, but then there's evidence he was in a different part of Spain than that based on evidence. So there is some conflicting evidence even based on that.
Okay.
So where am I going? I'm trying to find, in terms of looking into more about the techniques of the period authors, or of the Middle Eastern styles. There's the one that is currently out of print that I'm going to get either off of Interlibrary Loan. That's from Freelance Academy Press. That's really popular in terms of that. But I'm welcome to the pandemic. I'm having a hard time getting things from the libraries and doing research during this time on that. But anything you have, where am I going to get it from? Hopefully you for that is I'm going to get some references from you.
So I've got some ideas, and Valentin may be able to speak to some of these as well. So remember that Venice was the go-between point between the Ottoman Empire and Europe, right? Remember also that the Ottomans attacked all throughout Eastern Europe, and they got up to Vienna and actually took it over. So there's a lot of diaries from ship captains and from, Venetian sailors that talk about the fighting styles and what they had to go through with the Moors. And I will say in Venice, do what?
I'm getting chills right now. I'm really enjoying that there's sources out there.
Yeah, I mean, these aren't fight sources; these are diaries, right? Mm-hmm. So you'll be able to hopefully glean some ideas of tactics and stuff from some of these diaries. In Venice, Martin Sanudo was a historian in Venice. He talks about how there are many Moors in Venice, and I cannot verify this, but my thought is they're actually Ottomans because there's a whole lot of interaction there. So the Venetians might also blend the idea of the Moor versus the Ottoman. I don't know that for a fact, but it's quite possible that was European wide. So those are some other things to look at. I think I haven't looked into it. I think there's a lot of diaries about the siege of Vienna that talks about some of the fighting. So it may be something to also look into to see if you can glean from them.
And I mean, and that relates directly to the fact that even during that time, I mean, what we call modern Italy most of it was owned by Spain during that time anyway. And so that is directly applicable to what we're doing. I would love to hit you up after this possibly and ask you for some.
Absolutely. And I also recognize that the German Dusak quite likely came from the Ottoman curved sword. So a lot of the techniques that you might have seen in early Dusak manuals, it's possible. Now, this is all my hypothesizing. Could have come somewhat from what they saw the Ottomans doing with their curved swords. So that's another thing to look at.
Yeah, I was going to suggest Dusak text as well because it is a short curved blade, and there are far more techniques than just a cut from bow.
That's
awesome.
I hadn't even thought about the Dusak.
I don't know if you're familiar with Balbi.
In passing, I haven't done too much.
Yeah, this is available. So there's not a lot about fighting techniques, but it is interesting to talk about the first person who was at Malta.
And again, that's what I'm hoping to dig into as well, because again, I think that ties into not just the technique development, and I think that's applicable, but the cultural discussions that are raised by this as well. So.
And I'm kind of with Dave too. Is I think the Venetians kind of had just the culture. Everyone was an Ottoman. And, for example, the Janissaries were almost exclusively Balkans.
Right.
So, captured Balkans, captured as children. So.
Awesome. This is great. And the other thing I'm actually hoping to delve into a little bit is. If Pacheco is saying that he actually fought these people, where did he fight them? I need to look into that a little bit more in terms of like what the Moresco revolts happened when Pacheco was probably being born. So it didn't happen really at that time. So where was he actually fighting them if he's claiming this in his work? So.
Right.
Right. So gentlemen, if you're done with I'd like to comment next. Really interesting thing that you brought up here. I'm really excited to see this, and I would like to keep in contact with you as you learn more about this. For the past couple of years, I've been studying Razmafzar, historical Persian martial arts, outside of the SCA with Dr. Manusher Moshtaq Khorasani, one of his students here in the United States. who's in the Twin Cities. There's another one who's actually out east as well that I can put you in contact with. The iconography, I shouldn't say iconography, the depiction of the blade there, yeah, that doesn't look like a Persian or Turkish military sidearm. That definitely looks more like a civilian sidearm. And my thought was it looks a lot like the Italian storta, which would be kind of the shorter civilian sidearm falchion sort of thing. And yes, the Dusak as well. To look for something that's more the African influence on the Moors, I'd suggest contacting Damon Stith, who is the president of the Historical African Martial Arts Association. He's on Facebook. And
I follow them actually
okay.
on
Awesome.
but I don't know him in particular. But
okay, he taught a class at WMAW a couple of years ago on the Barbary saber, which was pretty much the Persian shamshir. The Turkish kılıç is a little different in shape. It's got a little bit of a sharpened edge along the back, about the first third of the blade, and that's going to handle a little different. I actually met a postdoc student out at a HEMA conference in Minneapolis, whose focus was on Turkish military things, Turkish fighting styles. I have to find contact information for him, but I'd be happy to put you in contact. And like everybody else was talking, I think it's yes, we're seeing a Renaissance version of Victorian Orientalism with the exotic and the other, and yes, kind of putting all the Islamic variations together and demonizing them as the other. Yeah,
he
really see that.
literally talks in there about how they're all going to go to hell. He says that flat out. So
understood. Yeah. But as the other commenters have been saying, yes, these other styles of fighting will definitely teach more than just what Silver would call the downright blow. And if we ever get a chance to be in the same place at the same time, I would love to go over some of this with you.
I really would. It's yeah. I was talking to both Marshal Remy about doing some of these techniques and the against the Italian, but also I was talking to a couple of other people out here that practice the practice of the Persian styles, about going over with them. I would love to. I hope this pandemic.
Yes.
Yes, all of these contacts, please. All of these references.
Yeah.
I'm just going to soak it all up and say thank you so much from the bottom
Sure.
of my research heart.
Malatesta of Venice at gmail.com.
I'm sorry, can you repeat that one more time?
Malatesta of Venice at gmail.com.
Laurels, if we can wrap up in the next minute, that'd be wonderful.
Sure. Sort of.
We can also get it to you from
Absolutely.
other ways.
Thank you.
All right. Looks like we're all set there. Looks like Elsie is back. I'm going to spotlight them. Hopefully technology works this time.
We'll see. Yeah, we'll see if my country internet holds still on this. Let me see if I stop my video and hit the screen share. Is that working for you all?
It looks like it's trying to.
Try turning on the video.
Yeah. Let's see what it's doing.
There we go. Now we can see it.
The beauty of working with courses is you get to live in great places with lousy internet.
Okay, now your audio is coming in choppy.
Here's an idea. Can she email that to you, Remy, and then you can show it while she talks? Just a thought.
Yeah, if I get a link, I can.
I mean, anyone with good connection is what I mean, really.
Yeah, actually, let me put my email in the chat, and you can send me your PowerPoint and then talk into it. The joys of. Is Elsie still in the room? No. Well, we're trying, folks. While we're waiting on that, I am also just going to share the next presentation that was sent to me via video. They had a work thing come up, so they're not able to make it now, but they would like their video shown, and their request was that the Laurels give feedback as part of this. They'll just go back and watch the recording instead of having you like write out feedback. So let's screen share. All right, does everyone see the same thing I'm seeing?
Yep.
This video, cool. Enjoy. Let me go all the way back. There you go.
I'm Ogata Injiro Tsui, mainly known as Sherman, and I am so very sorry that I couldn't deliver this presentation to you live. Your anticipation would be great to share this video and send me feedback, so I'm going to hop right into it. Thank you very much for the time. First, what do I mean by kenjutsu? So broadly, I'm referring to traditional schools of Japanese swordsmanship. A specific school and tradition that I've been researching is Yagyu Shinkage-ryu, or Yagyu New Shadow School. So some historical background about the school. We know it was founded sometime prior to 1565, and then passed on to the Yagyu family in 1594. Its central treatise was completed in 1632 by Yagyu Munenori. Also, the early headmasters of the Yagyu family, Munenori and Munetoshi, were known for being the official kenjutsu instructors to the shogunate. Now, here are some characteristics of the katana that I've been using to study and conduct this research on my own. It's the Castile standard katana with a 30-inch blade, 10-inch handle, 7.5 square inch guard. So that's a very small guard compared to what people are used to seeing on a rapier. That's going to be important later on. Generally, the katana favors the cut over the thrust, mostly because of that small guard. And in Japanese, that's the suba. Then, of the cuts that it favors, generally it's the draw cut over the percussive cut. Of what I've read and of what I've researched, a lot of attention is paid to slashing rather than percussive striking. So you don't strike with the katana as if you're just dealing cut with the mass of it alone. Rather, you use the cutting edge to its maximum effectiveness by dragging the edge and slashing smoothly, fluidly. So draw cut over the percussive cut. Now, here are some characteristics of Shinkage Ryu as I've been studying it. Generally, the posture features an oblique angle of the body to your opponent, very similar to what we see in rapier, but the feet are pointed roughly in the same direction, so a little bit different. Contributes to stepping differently as well. Now, the basic actions are generally vertical descending cuts. They're used to parry and attack simultaneously. Generally, the target areas of these cuts are going to be the hands, wrists, and the arms. You see some cuts to the head and body, but generally, it's Shinkage Ryu is an art of disabling the arms. And other basic actions include voiding the hands and body either through compass steps or passing steps. So now, why did I take on this challenge? Why do I choose to bring a katana to a rapier duel, so to speak? Mostly, it's because of these unique mechanical puzzles that I think this can introduce in fencing. The average rapier has a significant range advantage to the katana, but the katana, being a short two-hand sword, can be used with superior leverage. So neither of these weapons is necessarily better, though, but this kind of weapon pairing, I think, would be really interesting to explore. Basically, how can one sword counter something dramatically different that's also used very differently? Second, I think this is an opportunity to undertake extra-European research through a weapon that has a long, rich, and sometimes well-documented history. And like of that history, so many of the traditional kenjutsu schools from our period are like a lot of them are still surviving to this day. Shinkage Ryu being just one of them. I hope to cover more schools in the course of this research as well, but for now, starting with Shinkage Ryu. So generally, my goal is to do three things while I'm undertaking this research. I want to be respectful. I'm trying to foster an open dialogue with recognized practitioners of this art. Two, I want to be accurate in my portrayal of it, so that I can recommend good form based on credible sources. And lastly, I want to be effective. By developing functional theories, I want to encourage more people to try out and stick with kenjutsu. And now I think these points are pretty important because there are already pretty good katana simulators on the market. However, if we can't follow some of these points, and if we can't study kenjutsu respectfully, accurately, and effectively, then people are more likely to apply what they already know about rapier if they try to pick up a katana, and if the instruction isn't already there for them. So without knowing how to use the katana correctly, people might run into a bad time. Worse yet, they might think it's just a bad tool for the job, or that it's a worse rapier, when really, like they might just be using it as if they would use a rapier and not as if they would use a katana. So that's a couple things to keep in mind. Now, my sources so far for this research, those have come from translations from the historic scrolls of Shinkage Ryu, and those translations just being The Sword and the Mind by Hiroaki Sato, and The Life-Giving Sword by William Scott Wilson. Now, trying to take these two written sources together and like put together a complete view of the art is it's rough, if not impossible. So I'm supplementing this with video demonstrations by study groups such as Tokumekan and curated YouTube playlists by people like Douglas Tong. Now, Tokumekan is the official Shinkage Ryu study group of the Otsubo branch of the Owari line. They're based in Canada. They were founded in 1994 by Douglas Tong and authorized by Kajitsuka Yasushi, the 22nd Shihan of that particular line. Moving on. All right. And that's about as much as I wanted to say just in this video alone. If you're interested in more of the historical background of Shinkageryu, aside from the brief whistle-stop tour that I covered today, you can check out some of that historical info and even some bibliographic info about the scrolls of Shinkageryu. You can check that out all on my blog. It's called The Sword and the Mind and the Blog. You can find it on swordandmindandblogspot.com. And yeah, I look forward to hearing your feedback. Once again, Eric, thank you very much for your patience with this. Right? Oh yeah, and please enjoy the other presentations following this one. Have a good one.
Great. So that was fun to watch. My name is Arik, not Eric, but otherwise, that was cool. I'm gonna throw it over my laurels and keep this in grid view.
I can start at least from a kind of wider point of view. Like I had asked before, I would want to know the kind of context for this. What I think I'm getting is this is just sort of your initial exploration sort of path of research that you're talking about. I think it looks really interesting. I Googled one of your sources really quickly, the William Scott Wilson one, and just from the Amazon description, it looks like there's maybe a specific mindset that might be different or similar, but in different ways to Western martial arts. It talked about spiritualness and no sword and clearing the mind. So in addition to looking at the techniques, it seems like looking at the sort of philosophy and idea behind each different method of swords and how they are similar and different would be really interesting.
Yeah, so the things I would talk on, and I'll write Charlie and mention a few things. Exactly about Lissa said. For one, it's a different approach in some ways to swordplay, but there are a lot of good manuals that existed in the 16th century in Japan that you can go at, and you can use different aspects. I know there's one that the entire manual is about no sword technique and about how to disarm someone when you have no sword yourself. So lots of stuff to play with. I'm fascinated by what he was talking about, targeting the hands and the arms. A lot of the people I fight who try to use katanas tend to use them, like he said, as a cut and thruster, as a rapier sword, and they try and close and kill, and they end up double killing at best for the most part. Mm-hmm. So that's an interesting way to approach this, is you're trying to keep your distance and just take their hands and arms out of the way. I'd like to look more into that myself. For the group, I'll ask this question, because something Charlie brought up is there's existing lineages, which it's worth looking into because there are existing lineages. And I would actually ask, is an existing lineage a positive or a negative when we're studying historical swordplay? And I will leave it at that. I have my own opinions, my own thoughts, but I'll leave it at that for now.
Yeah, that's a really good point. I would also be, I am fairly ignorant of Japanese sword work in the historical tradition. And I also would be interested in looking at the range and attacking the hands and arms, similar to some which you can see in the Bolognese. So I would also like to look at that. I would question, and I would have to go look at his sources, is just how much of a difference a non-sharp blade versus a sharp blade makes. For example, Roland's work in 133 on how important having that sharp blade is on the bind. So it's one thing I would be interested in looking at.
Well, and one thing to note, Logos, and this is something I have looked a little bit into, their swords were created completely differently from the European swords, of course. They had limited steel. They had to marry the one steel to the other.
Because their ore sucked.
Yeah, their ore sucked. And so they put the good steel on the edge, which was more brittle, so they made a softer backbone. But one of the things that I do believe has happened is a lot of their parrying, a lot of their technique really does aim for the flat on flat. You're slicing into the slice so you don't parry against that edge because theirs were weaker. So I do think that happened a lot more than you see in the European manuals.
Great. Anything else from our Laurel panel?
Sure. So one of the sources he mentioned, The Sword in the Mind, awesome book, really good reference. I don't have the other one that he mentioned to hand, but another one that he might want to look at is Legacies of the Sword, which will talk a lot about not only somewhat on technique, but a lot more about the mindset of a traditional martial arts lineage, the Yuha as an overall thing. Anything by Carl Friday, by the way, is a really good and interesting read for somebody who's doing a Japanese persona. I'd love to compare notes at some point in time, having done some Japanese sword work in the SCA in the rapier context myself. Issues about sharp sword versus a rebaited training blade. That's an issue we're going to find anywhere in the SCA because we're not going to play with sharps. Different people that we've trained with outside of the SCA, yeah, they've done things with sharps. And yes, it does make a very big difference, especially in the bind. Yeah. I don't know that we can accurately reflect that at all within the parameters of our SCA combat sports, nor within what the parameters that we have set for historical combat ANS. But yeah, it's definitely something to think about. I do like the idea of targeting the hands for the draw cuts and push cuts. Also might want to talk to people who are doing some German martial arts and who are doing the Schnitt slicing techniques, if that would help for taking and applying the Japanese things to an SCA context. This was a really nice kind of general introduction to the idea of bringing in Japanese sword art into the SCA. I'd love to hear more about the specifics of the lineage that he's training with, what they're teaching, and I'd love to hear more about how he's taking what they're teaching and seeing the differences between that and SCA combat and how he's modifying that for application in the SCA.
Wonderful. Well, thank you so much to our panel of Laurels. I'm sure they will appreciate that feedback when they watch this afterwards. I'm going to throw it over to Miguel. Hopefully his backwoods Wisconsin internet is working.
All right, can everyone hear me? Oh.
Yes.
Let me start my presentation real quick. Oh, no, on the right one. Does everyone see my presentation?
Yep.
Great.
Yeah.
So I may have missed the missive a little bit when I talked with R2 about this. I'm going to give a real general overview of Polish Saber that I've been working with lately. So my presentation is an introduction to Polish Saber, specifically on foot, not on horseback. But we will talk about horses and cavalry a little bit. So I think that understanding any weapon or any historical education or learning process, you need to understand the place from where it comes. I'm a spatial ecologist in my mundane life. So I think about maps and your spatial context for things really regularly. And that's one thing I find really interesting about Polish Saber. So if we're talking about Poland in the 17th century, we're really talking about this Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth, which you can see in this map in the upper right. You can see that it's surrounded by numerous nations, right? Russia, Sweden, Ottoman Empire, the Habsburg Empire. And it is really situated in pretty far western, what we would consider Western Europe. And in the 17th century, this Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth was really a bridge of, or a meshing of cultures between Western European cultures and Middle Eastern cultures. And that's really where we get the saber, right? It is descendant of Middle Eastern cultures more than it is of Western cultures. So some really important context and some ideas that might make Polish saber make more sense is a little more history on the ruling class of the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth, which were the Ślączka, who were they believed themselves to be derived from descendants of Sumerian descent around the Black Sea. But we all know that, you know, descent can be pretty wormy sometimes. It's really interesting. They had a collective called the Shem, and the Shem, it represented this really interesting body that when a king would pass away, a Polish-Lithuanian king would pass away, Shem would come together and they would elect a new king. So these Ślączka were the ruling class. They elected the king, which I think is really novel and really adds to the historical context of this Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth. Also, there's a lot of variation. So unlike, say, you know, nobility in other Western European countries, or in Western European countries, the Ślączka, I'm going to butcher all the Polish, really had a lot of variation in power and wealth. So some were as poor as common folk, and other families were marked as being more powerful and owning more land and having more wealth than the king himself. And I think we can't talk about the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth or Polish sword fighting in general without just touching on the Hussars, which were the Polish-Lithuanian cavalry units. You can see a picture of them in the bottom right. And they're, I mean, just like really cool. They have this matchup of like Western European armor and Eastern armor. They made fame for themselves in releasing or in the battle to take back Vienna from the Ottoman empires, which was actually mentioned in some comments earlier. And they're just all around really cool. This picture we see here is a portrait of Polish king, not Augustus, Sobolewski, who actually helped liberate Vienna from the Ottomans. Liberate's the wrong word. Take back Vienna from the Ottomans. So the historical writings and context that I used to really develop this presentation, I'm going to butcher these names. In order, the guy wearing the red tunic is Jan Chrysostom. His book is called The Memoirs of a Polish Baroque. If you have a chance to read it, it's really great. It pretty much goes around like a Porthos-esque character and just kind of like, you know, talks about his memoirs going around Poland, getting drunk and sword fighting and like kind of pissing off other Ślączka. And then we have the second source is Franciszek Zaleski-Zareski, who is from, he was a Catholic priest who came from a nobility background and was a deputy commander of the Hussars and wrote a bit on their training style with the saber. Thirdly, we have Dredski Idokowicz. I'm sorry. And that's the guy all the way on the right. He wrote more on the sociological background of Poland at the time, but because sword fighting was really prevalent around the nobility, he wrote a couple of missives about it, but not a great deal. And then finally, a lot of the Polish sword or a lot of the Polish saber kind of combat comes from Michał Starzewski. That's as close as I can get. And this is very post-period. His manuscript came out in 1830, but a lot of those things are commented on in earlier kind of writings, but not penned down in, say, like a full treaty of fencing. So a lot of the images you're going to see are from Michał's book, but I would think that they're relatively applicable to previous styles of fighting. So I think also to talk about Polish saber, we need to talk about saber itself. So there's a singular cutting edge on a saber, which is actually not totally true. As you can see in this image all the way on the left, the upper 1/3, the false edge on the upper 1/3 also could have an edge on it, but that was not always true. What was almost always true, but not considered consistently, is that there was some curve to the blade, showing that Middle Eastern influence. Some examples of Hussar blades do have a straighter blade. But that may be, just a side thought, that may be a relic of the differences between fighting on horseback versus fighting on foot. So they almost all exclusively have a crossguard, and we can see the evolution of that crossguard in this top picture, from a very basic crossguard in 1, with additions of things like a knuckle bar and a thumb ring to help, which will come up later in my talk about why the knuckle bar and thumb ring probably came about. What I will say is missing, and it's very clearly missing, is any sort of basket hilt or enclosing on the hand that we would see in later period saber manuals, much similar like Hutton's saber manual. You don't see any close around the hand. So the hand is a really viable target. Let's start with just kind of a basics on footwork on stance. The treaties don't really expand on this greatly, but so much so as to say that your torso should be upright and that you should be in a comfortable stance with an ability to move in any direction. You should have your knees bent and an ability to be responsive, so you shouldn't be straight leg. That your weight should be relatively evenly distributed. Because of some of the aspects of saber fighting and the amount of tempo that it takes to do some actions, you want to be really mobile. And that is really conveyed in the writing. There aren't, say, as many specifics on like your foot has to be here, it has to be facing this way, et cetera, et cetera. So some of the single tempo footwork that we see are advances and retreats, which are, I think we're all pretty commonly known. Those are single tempo footworks where the feet do not cross. Then some of those 2 tempi footworks, we would see the pass forward and the pass backwards, both of which take 2, we know that tempo is kind of an interesting definition, right? There's lots of definitions for what a tempo is, and it's not a consistent thing. But most of those footworks are considered 2 tempo and are touched upon briefly in some of the historical writings. So let's talk about parries. So unlike that, you come from an Italian convention where they call it the cone of death, right? So it's that cone that if their blade pierces a cone, it will stab your body, right? So you're trying to push blades out to the outside of that cone. When you're working with a saber and a primarily cutting weapon, that turns into a square around your body. And your parries, your parries are made to intercept the blade at any point in that square that is going to cut you. Also, as a side note, I want to emphasize that these parries don't have to be active parries. They can also all be guards from which you can move. Some are more effective than others in being like moving between them, but you can stand in any of these to make an attack. But we call them parries because the transition between these positions is where you actually do the parry. So we see parry 1, which is you could typically, after you have drawn your saber, it would be an initial parry to an inside body cut. And you can see that the palm is facing forward. Parry 2 is the palm is facing away from your body, and it is used to block any horizontal cuts. Parry 3 is an outside cut, and really this parry 3 position is the position where you will spend typically most of your time saber fighting because you can move to any of the other parries very easily. Continuing these parries, right, parry 4 is the opposite of parry 3. So parry 3 is blocking an outside line cut. Parry 4 is blocking an inside line cut or a cut to your main torso from right to left. And it's just a simple move over from 3 to 4. And then finally, 5 and 6 are 2 ways to block your overhead cuts, as Hirogo described, those villainous, vulgar overhead cuts, right? This is how we can stop those with a Polish saber. One is to, with your palm out, raise up your blade and make sure that you have an angle to this. I think this drawing is not terribly representative of what you actually want, or as described in the text, which is much more angulation, so that the downward force of the blade allows it to follow a separate line. You're not taking all of that force directly on your blade. So then we can go into attacks, and I am over time. I will wrap it up very quickly. You see this image from before. The things I really want to touch on attacks is, these cuts can come at really any angle, but there are set angles at which you would see cuts thrown from. None of these, I think as a point, is none of them are focused at the legs, which I think is an important point that we see in later manuals, but not in 17th century manuals. Also, remember that I mentioned earlier that there wasn't any guard of the hand. Very commonly touched upon in the historical text are duels that would happen that would end by one of the opponents cutting the other opponent in the hand and ending the fight because they could no longer use a blade. So this is really common, really happens all the time, and I think that also kind of leads us to last presentation that we saw about the katanas being used to slice to the hands and arms, to really disable your opponent And also there's another historical context there where if you killed your opponent, the family could sue you and take all your money. To some kid, there's context of that happening. So just disarming them was actually a really viable way to end a dispute, while also not like getting yourself in hot water with the rest of the rest of the ruling class. And finally, there are thrusts with a saber. The context that you need to understand with a thrust with a saber is that with that curved blade, it just moves differently than say a straight rapier. But they are documented, and they are still, as we know, one of the faster techniques. But that blade, it just kind of forms differently, and it means that it can be parried differently from stopping a thrust. So if anybody has any questions, my main source here for this was the Polish Saber Manual by Richard Martin, which is a really good kind of introduction to fighting with curved blades. He talked about curved blades a lot from lots of different fashions, from German fashions, Italian fashions, Polish fashions specifically. And there's lots of good interpretation. And if anybody has any questions, let me know. Sorry, Eric, I went a little long.
Great. No worries. Thank you so much for your help. I'm gonna hand it over to our laurels now.
Can I quit sharing my screen, or can you still see my screen?
We can still see it.
Okay, hold on. Let me figure out how to stop doing that.
Well, while you're doing that, why don't I start with just a few kind of broader ideas. So again, thinking about who your audience for this is, if you're going to be working on this with people who sort of are very familiar with that Italian rapier tradition, I think you might want to do a little bit more in some places to compare it. That might help people see the differences and see the uniqueness of what you're talking about. I think you did a good job of that when you talked about the cone of death versus the other parries, but for things like the stance and then the cuts, especially, how are they different and similar from that system that maybe most people would come into your presentation knowing? The other suggestion I would have is you talk about the sort of historical situation, the kings, etc. And then towards the end, you talk about, I think, something to do with like dueling. I think you want to make that connection a little bit more explicit, especially at the start. What is the social context that we are using these swords in? Is it civilian fighting? Is it military fighting? Just to create that bridge so we can understand throughout your presentation why people are using this, how, etc.
For sure. Thank you so much.
So a few comments from me. You start off with your sources and talking about 1699, and I know Polish saber manuals are post SCA time period. So one of the things I'd be interested in, and not to answer now, but just in future presentations, what's the earliest you find styles that eventually became Polish saber? In other words, what are their ancestors? Where did they come from? And part of working through that, the complex guard that we know of in the European swords started happening when the civilians started wearing guards, started wearing swords. And so the Polish never really developed those complex guards. So one of the questions it's in my head is, were these more civilian or more military? Did they use gauntlets when they fought with these, or were they barehanded? So, another thing to try and suss out. And
those
then
were
finally,
very barehanded. It was a status symbol, right? They were only worn by the ruling class.
Okay.
Yeah.
So both civilian and military in that case.
Yes, very much so.
Okay. And so the last thing I'll point out is, instead of comparing this to the rapiers, and I put rapier in quotes, the better corollaries here would be the Bolognese and the Dusak manuals. At every guard that you showed, I could show you a corollary in the Bolognese manuals. And so what I might say is pre-Agrippa. So the Marazzo, the Mancilino, and then all the different Dusaks. So that's a closer corollary, I think, to the Polish saber than when you talk about the cone of defense from the rapier.
For sure.
But very good, cool.
Yeah, nice basic. My question is, how concerned are you about the historical backhingings of this. In other words, how the Poles are famous for what we would call cultural theft. I mean, they would take something and say, well, we've always done it that way. It's always been Polish, when it was Italian last week. I mean, they were famous for that.
I mean, I think that, sorry, finish your question, my bad.
No. So I'm saying, so how are you dealing with that, and how, getting back to the earliest sources, and do you care?
Yeah, I think that it's a really interesting question because Poland is situated so centrally in that area between like Western Europe and the Middle East. I mean, you can obviously see that there are curved blades, right? You can see that there are, out of the Ottoman Empire, kind of like curved blade fighting styles that showed some reality. I think that idea of theirs taking things, and it's actually commented multiple times in the manuals of when the Hussars, when they came into Vienna and released Vienna, they went into the Ottoman camp dressed like good Hussars, and then they came out dressed like Ottomans. So they stole all their stuff, right? Like, I think that, I think that, and I think this harkens back to the last gentleman from the West. I think that there are so many ways that you can move a sword, and I think that the practical aspect, which was my original thought on this presentation, the practical use of the saber really got away more into like an understanding the historical context of the weapon. So I think that, I think that to really answer your question, I think that, we have to take all of the historical sources with some grain of salt, which I think Rogo's presentation really hit home on, right? That if this is going to be, if they're going to suck up and appropriate cultures from any aspect, that's really a separate question than say like, how do you fight with this novel weapon that doesn't move like a rapier and doesn't fight like a rapier and doesn't make sense to work like a rapier? I guess, is that kind of answering your question, or is that just beating around?
Yeah, that's exactly. Okay. I was just trying to figure out, that's good.
Great.
Any other questions from our laurels? Wonderful. Okay. So now we're going to try one more time to give Elsie a chance. I am going to press the button so they sent me an email with their PowerPoint. So they're going to yell, Raphael, press the button a lot of times as they talk into the mic, because apparently their internet either allows audio or video, but not both. So let's.
The beautiful thing of my house is I can have my horses here. The bad news is my internet is terrible. So
okay.
Go ahead and start it, and we can go ahead and move it to the slide that has Fiore on it. So upper right hand, it says present.
Oh, there it is. I have the people.
Yeah.
Great. Just say press the button a bunch of times, and I'll do that.
Okay, press the button twice.
Great.
One more. Yep, so that's moves. All right, let's get a little bit into the meat of the matter since we're delayed in starting this. Thank you all for your patience. This is sort of a starting place for looking at Rostvechten. We're actually very fortunate as we're starting to explore these mounted combat manuals that there is a tremendous amount of work that's already been done. But where we see the limitations in a lot of the existing works from looking at the fight books is that while there is a tremendous detail in what the writer does with engaging their opponent, what the horse is actually doing is sort of the vegetables of fight books. We all know they ate vegetables. They're a little hard sometimes to find in the period cookbooks. Next slide, please. Fortunately, starting really in about the mid-16th century, there's a pretty robust group of riding manuals, really, that are looking at riding and training. A lot of this started out of the Neapolitan school. The one who was probably most known for publishing himself was Bressoni, and his work was published in 1550. I like this one as a basic starting place because there were 23 different Italian editions. It was translated into 5 other European languages in period. And we do have a surviving period English translation / adaptation from 1561. There's also a more modern English adaptation. The quotes that we'll be working from today are from Blundell's 1561 adaptation. Next slide, please. So, what they were looking at in these sorts of manuals is they were starting to talk about how skillful riders rode. And they talk about how to train the horse as well as what aids to use, which are the ways that a rider can communicate with his horse. And really, when we will talk about going out and menaging, you will see repeated again and again in these manuals. And as Blundell tells us, what it really is it's just a skillful way of handling his horse or his weapon. Next slide, please. And what we wind up with when we're talking about menaging is there are 4 different types. For today, we're going to focus in on the turns, which are these tight turns that you see bracketed out in red in the patterns that are published within the book. Particularly, we're looking in these areas because they are useful training tools for later applying into Rospect and sparring. Next slide. So specifically, we're going to start off actually with large circles, or what they will talk about as the rings. You've got the quotation from Blundell, and to give sort of a modern redaction of that to things that would make sense to a modern rider, what you actually do is you come in, you ride 2 circles to the right. We're looking at something that's got about a 7 to 10 meter diameter to it. We change reins onto the left hand, ride 2 circles to the left. We change reins back to the right hand and we ride 2 more circles and then we trot out forward. Next slide. This may not look very much like fighting at this point, but it actually has some value to it in terms of what we're asking the horses to do. Modern figures of 8 are a very common way for us to supple up horses, and they allow us to address the muscles on both the left side and the right side. Horses themselves tend to be naturally left-sided, just like humans tend to be right-handed. And I believe that's a portion of the reason that he talks about not only always starting to the right, but always ending on the right. Also, passes tend to be, in Rospect, and tend to be conducted right hand to right hand. Can we go ahead and hit play on the video?
Sure thing. Maybe.
Oh, back one. It may play in this view if we can't get it to play in the other. There we go. All right. And you can mute the video if that setting didn't seem to go through. But what we're looking at here is this is actually me ground driving my horse. And what you can see is he makes turns. His spine actually bends to take that curve of that circle, which is part of the reason those diagrams become so important. As we go ahead and change reins, and we're not doing quite a true figure 8 here because I'm a little flat through. I was trying to avoid the truck that my husband was up on filming from. But as we change from the left to the right, he shifts his bend back to the other direction. And you can see where his spine continues to follow that curve. So next slide. That's the beginnings of what we're looking at. And that concept of bend becomes important as we start getting into the tighter turns. Blundell goes ahead and breaks down the turns from Grissoni's descriptions. And we've got a half turn, which is basically the horse is heading one direction and then he's gone 180. A whole turn would be a 360. And then the volta rapidoppia, and one of you Italians can hopefully correct my pronunciation on that, would be a 720-degree turn, which is asking the horse to hold this position and demonstrate this strength for quite a lot of time and requires a lot of control on the part of the rider. Next slide. And we use these discipline under different names. In the prior slide, I kind of redacted it as being a rollback or a pirouette, and it's something that's still used modernly because, again, it gives us both shoulder and hip control and also helps us develop the horse's back muscles and abdominal muscles. Can you hit play, please?
Oh.
Prior one.
Yeah.
So what I'm doing is we're doing some circles and some rollbacks, and I've got you guys, this is left reins in one hand. I've got you guys up on the horse with me. You can see where he tips his head back to the right as we do our spin around. We pick up our canter and we go back and we ride another circle. I don't have enough space in my quarantine riding area to ride these patterns quite properly. We go ahead, we halt again, tip his nose back to the left, bring him around with my legs and my hips, and we pick up our left lead canter. So if we go on to the next slide and go ahead and play that video, this is going to be that same exercise but viewed from the side. So we've got him on a left lead canter here. And if you look very closely, you can watch how he flexes down through his hips and engages his abdominal muscles as we're doing the exercise. This is building stability. Some of the simple leans that work as voids, if you're on the ground, lose something on horseback. So I need to actually have the horse be able to move out from underneath, move out with me underneath my body for me to get in and out of position to land my attacks. And next slide. So this doesn't always work quite perfectly as planned. And one of the nice things about Grissoni is not only does he lay out some of the patterns and the things that you can do, he also gives a fair amount of descriptor on what sorts of things can you do to correct the faults that happen. If you can hit play on the video. We talked about, we want his head turned into the turn. This is actually, if we do we're starting to work on schooling the double turns with him here. And what we want is we want his bend in the direction of travel, which allows us to pick up a nice left lead canter. And there we go. And then he's going to come back down and we're going to do the same thing to the right. So we shift to a right bend. I lose his hip there a little bit. And what we're asking him to do is we're asking those shoulders to come around. The hind feet are staying within a smaller circle, or at least they're supposed to be. And the shoulders are traveling around a larger circle. That allows him to engage his abdominal muscles on both sides to build those muscles up so that, again, he develops that core strength that is needed to become a steady fighting platform for me and to get me in where I need to deliver my shots. Perfect. And then we balance him up. And we've got our right lead canter. Next slide. So what does this really all come back to? What we need is a slightly different horse for doing combat. This video on the left is me riding my mule, who's a very flat mover. He'd be more like a palfrey. If I drop a sword, he doesn't generate very much power. He's just flat and smooth and easy to ride. In contrast, in the next video, I have the best tech crew ever. In the next video, we're doing the same exercise with Moose, where that up and down and that engagement of his haunches and his abdominal muscles he's creating actually all that sword power. All I'm doing is dropping and keeping it from hitting the ground, but he's generating that sword power with that up and down motion. So not only do these exercises give me the ability to get the horse into play in a more precise manner, because Ross-Fecton encounters are very fast. They also, if we were trying to generate power, they would allow me to create a horse that can generate power as well. Thank you. And thank you, tech crew.
Wonderful. Thank you so much for that. It's always good to see another dimension to how sword fighting historically worked. I'm going to throw it over to our wonderful panel of laurels now.
So this is Aaron. So super, super cool. I have friends in Austin who are doing something similar to this. If you know Sean Gulick or Jennifer Jobst, they're reading the same manuals and doing the same thing. Question I have, and I think you kind of answered it, but I'll ask it and see more clearly. When I'm throwing a cut in the Bolognese school and in any cuts that I throw, I'm using my weight on impact to generate that percussive moment or instant, you might say. It seems like the entire weight of the horse moving should generate the cuts, but do you have to make the horse hit that downward motion at the same instant of your cut, or is just the motion of the horse moving enough to generate enough power?
The motion of the horse moving generates a tremendous amount of power. What I find with, thinking of those last two videos, what I find is that the movement of the horse generates the return of the sword better. If I've got a horse with a lot of up and down motion, the place that it becomes more important actually is when you get into the wrestling. Because if you're trying to get somebody up and out of a saddle with a high front and a very high back, being able to have that wave-like motion and hitting the timing right on that, you lift them up and out. So a lot of what we're doing, and this chestnut, this red horse doesn't have it down completely, but you wind up with a more and more what we refer to as collected motion, where the horse gets to the point where they're almost cantering in place. Because if you're cantering at speed past each other, there's just not time. But if you go through and you look at the foot placement, a lot of stuff is done out of a walk or a trot. But when you get into the wrestling, you'll start to see what's sometimes referred to as a terre-à-terre, or you'll sometimes a gallop-galliard you'll see in some of the manuals. And what you've got is that 3-beat canter stride becomes almost a 2-beat where the front end and the back end separate. And that's how you're generating that force to unhorse somebody else.
Wow. So you're like going into an arm lock and then using your feet to get the horse to come up and generate that power. Is that what you're doing?
Yeah, actually, most of it comes from my pelvis. The things what actually with that particular red horse, if you could see when he was cantering, he brings his front legs up very high. If I lift my thighs up into, and I'm in a little more of a seated position than if I were riding a librita, but if I bring my legs up towards my abdomen, he actually brings his legs up higher. And actually, if I stop lifting my legs up, he just plants all 4 feet on the ground and stops.
Wow. Okay, cool. Wow.
So you actually hit on what I was going to ask you about, because you're talking about the collected canter, which I find when I've done a little bit of raw specting, I've stopped doing it because I got thrown and hurt very badly. I found the collected canter the most useful gait because it lets you change direction quickly and put on the burst of speed when you need it.
Yeah, it makes a big difference, and you've got a horse that's up underneath you.
Right, the horse is already in that motion, and when you can pull it down in collection, it's no big deal for them to just add the power to it, whereas if you're in a trot, going into the canter is a much more difficult proposition, especially for us lousy riders like me.
Well, and that's the thing. The only thing I would change to that, and we do actually have some evidence that they changed gaits during encounters. What I find is you get a more highly trained horse, and when moose is working well, changing between the gaits isn't difficult because you are changing the beats, but you're not really changing the rhythm. If you think about singing a song in your head, I can walk, trot, and canter all within the rhythm of that song, even though that's a 4-beat, a 2-beat, and a 3-beat gait. So if you've got a horse that's working in that consistent, steady rhythm and that is on the aids and listening to you, that you don't lose much in changing gait. You lose a tiny bit.
Okay. Cool. Nice work.
Thank you.
Okay, I can talk a little bit next. like I've been doing before, I'm coming more from the perspective of someone who doesn't know a lot of the details. And I think depending on what audience you're going to be presenting this to, especially if you continue to work within the martial arts ANS, or even ANS in general, there's a much smaller population of people who get to play with horses. So one thing I'm going to encourage you to do as far as presentations is really step back to think about making the purpose or goal clear and the context clear at the start as you move forward. Just because I think I'm not very familiar. I rode a horse a couple times in trail riding, and I read books when I was little. I mean, really, that's my knowledge of horses. So also starting from some of those basics, how and why is that training important? How does that then impact what is able to be done with the moves? It seemed like at the beginning you were focusing on the similarities in their training to our training, but just kind of thinking through those connections and how you're bringing your audience with you in terms of following it and understanding. A lot of this is also coming from kind of like librarian and English major background. So just kind of thinking about that.
Thank you.
Elsie, your audio seems to have cut out, possibly.
Oh, can you hear me now? Yep. So thank you, Lisa.
I don't know much about horses and horseback riding. It's something I'd love to learn more about. I got a chance to see some of it at Gulf Wars a few years ago. And it was really interesting to start to see some of the things in Fiore's manual that I've done on foot, to see these applied on horseback. And I'm really excited that there are people who are exploring this now in the SCA. And I'm just all kinds of excited for you and really glad that you folks are getting a chance to do this. I don't really know much, like I said, but I'd love to see more. So cool, keep going.
Thank you. I'll give my thank you again in case my there we go. Looks like my thing's working, but thank you very much. And thank you, Raphael, for helping me work through the technical difficulties. And thank you all for your patience.
My pleasure. All right. Wonderful. So are there any other questions from the Laurels before I go to the next person?
My last thing, and this is just speculative, I seem to remember that Gisleri actually published sometime a book on horseback riding, and he was a captain in Italy. And that might be something to look for. I've never seen it, but I've read that he did. So that would be 60s or so, 50s maybe, 1550s. So anyway, just another source to keep your eye out for, I think.
Thank you.
Great. So thank you all so much. I really enjoy seeing those like alternative aspects to the SCA that we don't often see, that were very, very common in period, because they didn't have cars to go to events with, but that we don't talk about as much. Do we have, Killian, were you able to come here? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Okay, cool. It looks like Killian wasn't able to make it today. If they show up during this last bit, that'll be dandy. With that, I am going to throw it over to Remy.
All right, let's do my screen share. Cool, everyone see my screen just fine? Awesome. So we're just going to kind of look over a quick overview of what the French fencing culture was like. Specifically, because I only have 10 minutes, we're going to look at kind of what the fencing styles or fencing schools kind of look like, how they operated. This really kind of just to give people kind of context. This is really just me trying to flesh out my own SCA persona and kind of figure out what I, as Remy, would have probably gone through or would try to do as a master of defense and kind of stuff. So a lot of this is going to be specific to the fencing masters in Paris. We will look a little bit at some of the fencing schools in the northwest part of France. And I'll try to call out where we kind of shift back from regions and stuff. But for the most part, during the first half of the 16th century, the Parisian fencing masters were all kind of like isolated. And they realized, hey, if we kind of band together, we might have a little bit more power and we can kind of control who can legally teach fencing in Paris and kick the people who don't meet our standards. If we just don't like, kind of to the wayside, sue them, make some money, close them out, and all that kind of stuff. This specifically seems to be really kind of aimed at Italian masters, because during this portion of time, even though when we think of the French, we think of like duelists and then just killing each other off and stuff, the French didn't really really hit their own stride as a teaching culture in terms of like spreading it out throughout Europe until like the later half of the 17th century, when we got like a small sword. So at this point, the French were either importing Italian masters to teach their kids, or they were sending their kids out to Italy to learn and stuff. So I think some of these things were about them just trying to kind of kick the Italians out. The Italians were also like very deep in the governing of France and stuff. They had like a lot of Italian queens and stuff like that. And so the Italian queens were bringing in some of their Italian friends. So there's a little bit of, I think, hostility towards the Italians and stuff that comes together. By the end of the 16th century, King Charles IX took the rules that the Parisian fencing masters, like the outline that they created, signed it, so basically chartered them in as the corporation of the Master of Indies of Arms in Paris. And this would be basically the governing body for the Parisian French fencing masters until 1791, when the French Revolution kind of shut it down. It came back when the Bourbon monarchy got reinstalled. And it still kind of runs, but it's not under the name of the Corporation of the Master Indeed. It's the Académie d'Armes of Paris. And this over here is basically the heraldry that King Louis XIV gave them, and that's kind of what the Academy of the Arms of Paris still uses. So they've kind of just adopted that nowadays and stuff. So the charter got like updated several times during the late 16th and early mid 17th century. And a lot of it was kind of like creating officers, and like you would get fines if one of the officers came by, saw that your gear wasn't up to par, you get fined. But a lot of it was really just kind of controlling who could teach fencing in Paris and the neighborhoods of Paris. So it really comes down to protecting their income. People who were not basically certified, as it were, with this corporation were called ferrières. So mundanely, that word means junkyard, but like in period, it was a duelist or a sable rattler. So it's basically a derogatory term for someone who was teaching fencing under the table, more or less. Again, the Italians seem to be especially targeted by a lot of these regulations and stuff. And by 1656, there were just 25 fencing masters in Paris, which isn't a lot considering how big the city and the surrounding areas is. And even by then, Louis XIV wanted to downsize that to just 20. I haven't figured out why. I haven't found any sources saying why there was only just 25 or why Louis specifically wanted to lower. I can see why the corporation wanted to keep it small. The fewer of them there are, the more money they can make. But I'm not sure why Louis was like, yeah, let's lower it down less. Maybe the masses were like, hey, can we just kind of like cut this down a little bit? So now we're going to look at what it looked like inside the fencing salon. This is specifically from in Paris. So the King's preacher, Pastor Etienne Benet, wrote a book under the pseudonym René Francois, and one of the chapters was what he saw in the French fencing salons. And a lot of it was terminology, but we do kind of see some cool cultural things, which is kind of cool if we kind of also compare to what we do in the SCA. So the French at this point were using a foil, and it looked like a rapier. It just, instead of a sharp point, they had a button. So it was collected in a knot, turned over in like this little diamond shape. And on the end of this button was a ball or padded leather, kind of like we use rubber tips. So it's kind of cool at this point to kind of just see a little bit of correlation or similarities between what we do. And if you caught someone that didn't have like this ball or rubber tip, you tell them to go put an end on the foil, kind of like we just say, go put your tip on, your tip's not looking that good. It's kind of something we would do nowadays as a marshal and stuff. So this is a close-up of one of those fencing foils. This is specifically from Italy. I couldn't find any specific from France, but I'd imagine that it looks pretty similar. Some customs in the French salon. They didn't, like in the SAA, we really say like, hey, you got a good kill on me, I got a good kill on you, but they didn't, no one made kills. They didn't make strikes. They either receive strikes or give strikes. And this seems to really kind of like, even kind of like see that, I feel like in some modern Olympic traditions and stuff, it was like giving and receiving versus like killing and stuff. I know in the SCA, some people feel kind of weird about saying I killed that person. So if you're one of those people, this is a nice alternate period way of talking about exchanging blows and stuff, and just saying I gave or received a strike. If you wanted to free fence with somebody, you'd go up to them and be like, do you want to make a do or do you want to make an assault? So basically, do you want to free fence? I just really like the phrase making it an assault. It just kind of has a little bit of cool like poetry, I think, to it, which kind of like. No headshots, no face shots. They would say, Messieurs, protect your eyes, because they didn't have fencing masks at this point. So they really wanted to make sure that they were protecting their eyes. Of course, you're fencing, stuff happens. So if you accidentally hit your buddy in the face, you put your weapon down, check in on them, make sure that they're fine and everything like that. The passes were strictly thrust only. There was a quote that says, we do not use at this time cuts for cutting strikes or the knocked and true strikes of the Swiss and Germans. So it seems to be a little bit of either at best some trash talk and maybe a little xenophobia that, you know, kind of going back to what Droga was talking about with like the Spanish and stuff, of all the different countries kind of trash talking all the other countries because their way is clearly the best way. What I feel like it also kind of works with, like, you look at the SCA, everyone thinks what they do, either they're locally or kingdom-wise or regions, better than all the other kingdoms and stuff like that. And I think this thrust-centric culture would lead to an environment in which the small sword would develop if we're not really worried about cuts and blocking cuts or throwing cuts, and we're really just working about thrusts, with looking for something that's going to be thinner, shorter, or not necessarily shorter, but thinner and quicker and lighter. So I think that's why we kind of see the French kind of go away from the rapier into that transitional rapier and then into small swords and stuff. The role of the fencing master, they didn't really do any free fencing. The provost was really the highest ranking member in the schools that you would see free fence. The master's role was to instruct and to basically watch the free fences and to make sure that no one's losing their cool and stuff like that. The French also didn't really put out a lot of fencing manuals at this time until really the small sword kind of came out. They had a few. They didn't really have a lot of images, but and most of the books that did come out around this time were more just text only. So now if we kind of shift over to the northwest region part of France, there's some ordinances that kind of listed out what some of the rules were in the cells, and they kind of broke down to politeness. So just general rules about like how to make sure you're being polite and salute like your fellow students. I enjoy the part about no dirty stories, dirty stories and no burping or farting. Just kind of really gives like a nice little like, there was a reason that rule needed to be made, and I just kind of like that that rule was made. Stuff about respecting the weapons, don't drop them, don't put your foot on them. And safety, like don't walk between two people that are fighting. Sometimes even now in the SCA, we need to kind of remind people, you know, go around them, be kind of nice and not kind of interfere. So now we kind of look at how do you become a fencing master. In the mid-16th century, you would basically, as you enter an agreement with a fencing master, you would swear on the cross saying you wouldn't use this art to commit crimes, but to use it for honorably for church king and your master. You don't want to make your teacher look bad. You would pay a fee, either like half up front and then half at the end, a weekly subscription, or like a monthly subscription like Patreon, or like a flat fee. The initial training lasted 4 to 6 weeks. There were a couple of tests. One was called Passer en roue, which is passing the wheel. I haven't really figured out what this means culturally, or like where in the hierarchy or like your learning process this would be. And then Passer in defense. And this usually would, I'm also not sure like how this plays into your hierarchy as you kind of upgrade. Like, did you need to pass these things to become a provost, or this was part of being a provost and stuff like that? But if we go back to Paris, where we look at specifically what the provost had to do, you had to be a provost for a set amount of time. It started off as 2 years, then it got bumped up to 4 years, and then finally 6 years. So your time as an apprentice kind of got longer and longer. There was a religious test imposed on all candidates, which isn't surprising in France. France in the 16th century kind of went through a bunch of religious civil wars, and then they were getting ready to kind of jump into the 30 Years' War, which is part religious, part political, at least from the French perspective. So it's not too surprising that, again, they're trying to limit who they're allowing to be part of their cool kids club. In the 40s, they kind of made minimal age requirement, 25 years old for new masters. If your dad was a fencing master, you got 3 years shaved off. So a little bit of nepotism. But you also kind of grew up in that martial arts culture, so I can kind of see that a little bit. Masters could only take one provost at a time unless another master died, and then one of the other masters could basically adopt a second provost to kind of help finish their training, which is kind of cool. The exam, provosts had to show their mastery on a whole bunch of different forms: single sword, single and dagger, halberd, and baton du boots. Which is two-headed baton. There's a picture of it on the right, this is actually from a German manual, but in his introduction, Pascal talks about how this is really just a French form, and it's really good for fighting off multiple opponents, which I think is really cool, just in terms of looking at that. The two-handed sword was added in later, but really they just needed to show competence in bouts with the foil and the sword and dagger. And again, there's some theories that these other forms were mostly trying to keep out like the Italians, who were just really concentrated on single sword and single and dagger and stuff. They only really had to do their fights with the sword and dagger, but they had to show that they knew how to use these other forms. Tests were made public. They had to fight different masters. I'm running a little bit out of time, so I'm just gonna kind of like bust through this a little bit faster and stuff. If you lost to the first two masters pretty cleanly, you got basically sent home to study some more. You presented a pair of gloves to your master as a thank you for all those years of teaching. They probably kind of like ran through a pair of gloves over those 2 to 6 years. And if you wanted any of the prize fights, you would give the prize to your master and stuff like that. But I kind of thought it was also cool that these test and prize fights were done in public, usually at a tennis court traditionally. And that is it. I'm sorry I kind of ran over time. I can make anyone that wants to like look at these slides, I'm more than happy to kind of send it to people to look at it in a little bit more detail.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Remy. I'm going to hand it over to our other roles now.
So I've got a number of questions. So if anyone wants to go first, I'll address mine in a little bit. Or I can go. Oh, go ahead, Lisa.
Why don't you go? I can talk to Remy later too.
Okay. So question number one, how does Henri Saint-Didier fit into this?
Yeah, so he was one of the few French fencing masters that kind of published a fencing manual. I haven't dove too deep into it, but from what I've gathered, that it's pretty much Italian inspired and stuff in terms of like the techniques and stuff he uses. So I don't have a lot of currently a better answer than that, and other than like he was one of the few French fencing masters that put out a book that had some actual pictures and illustrations attached to it. So the next thing I should do is kind of like tie in these masters into like the cultures and stuff like that.
Yeah. So he would be in the time when they isolated themselves, as you said, it sounds like.
Yeah.
So this is more of a comment than a question. You talked about reducing from 25 to 20. Bologna in the 1500s actually regulated the cost, not the number. So it'd be interesting to look that up and to kind of compare the different ways of paying your fencing masters, or why, like you said, why he would want to reduce his fencing masters. That's just a comment.
Yeah.
So two more things. One, can you speak on the shape of the fencing foil blade? I have big thoughts on that, but I want you to try and suss out more why it's shaped the way it's shaped.
Yeah, so like I haven't found a ton of information from in terms of like a metallurgy perspective, other than at this point, it seems like the blacksmiths were better at creating a better temper blade, so we can get a little bit more bend. And it definitely seems to be more squarish. So there's not really like any like a sharp diamond edge or whatever, but it seems to be more squarish. Maybe not quite like a modern foil, but definitely a little bit of a thickerness to the blade. And then you have like that kind of diamond point and stuff. You can kind of, that's mostly from a visual in terms of looking at those two pictures. The blade definitely looks thicker than I would expect an actual rapier blade to be. And then you got like that thicker head kind of like at the end for the point.
Yeah, yeah. So my thought, and so far my handling of all these blades bears this out. When you're not using a sharp, when you make a sword into a blunt, to balance it like you would a sharp, you have to actually remove a lot of steel from the blade edge and bring it back into the hand. So you end up with that look where you've got a very thick ricasso and then it quickly narrows down. And there are different ways to do it. This is one of the reasons I like the blade maker that I use. But if you make a sword look like a sharp, but it's got a blunt edge, that actually adds a whole lot of steel all the way down the blade, which gives you a very forward-weighted blade.
Yeah.
So it's an interesting point that you might bring up at some point if you gave this in person about why they make the swords not look like swords, whereas we try to make them look like swords, and we have an unbalanced sword sometimes.
Yeah, it'd be cool to kind of like try to find what the weight and weight distribution, like if there's any like studies and actual numbers of that would be kind of cool to add in there, I think. Yeah.
Yeah, I've been wanting to document all the different foils, all the different practice blades around the world. I know there's like 4 or 5 swords I'm aware of and 2 or 3 daggers I'm aware of. So at some point. Last question.
I've seen probably a dozen.
Oh, have you really?
Yeah.
You got to document that shit, man.
Yeah, I know. There's a couple on the Stubbart. There's one in the Bargello. There's one in the Bicanal.
Yeah. New York Met has the dagger.
Yeah.
Last question, and this is I'm throwing the gauntlet at you, man. I read an article that was interesting, and it hinted very strongly that Richelieu sent out dancing masters and fencing masters around Europe as his spies, and that's why the French techniques became prevalent around Europe during the small sword era, not because they were better, but because he was paying them under the table to start their schools up. What do you think about that, man?
I have not heard that conspiracy theory, but I will dig into the deep internet historical data and see what I could find.
Richelieu was an evil genius. What can
if nothing else, that sounds like a great plot for a book, though.
Yeah. Anyway, that's all I got.
Yeah, no, that's great.
So I have a question. Where does Cavalcabo fit in?
I have no idea.
Okay.
That's my honest answer. Yeah.
Yeah, because he was from Bologna, though he's actually in the Rome tradition. But he instructed Henry IV's children, which would have been Louis. I was wondering if he was in the guild or not.
Yeah, I'm not sure. So I have the book. One of my resources actually lists out who the initial fencing masters were. I haven't really like gone through to try to line up any of like the books that have been published and stuff, or like the Royal Masters.
I was just interested because though he was Italian, but obviously under royal patronage, whether they accepted him or not. So
yeah, so like what happened a lot is that the royalty would like take whoever they wanted, and they would just like make exceptions even though they weren't supposed to. And sometimes that would lead to lawsuits, and that it would be just kind of narrowed down to, all right, you can only teach these 3 people in this one particular household, but no one else. So it wouldn't surprise me if he was literally just limited to like Henry IV's kids, and that was it, and everyone just kind of gave him the stink eye otherwise.
That's really my only question. Nice paper.
Thank you.
So my thoughts are, again, kind of always going to be on kind of audience and where to go from here. One thing I was thinking, if you're using this for persona development, I'd love to see sort of how you take this and then incorporate that into your persona, into how you act. I like the comparisons between what we do and what they did. So just kind of bringing the past closer to us. We're all the same people. We all tell the same fart jokes. In addition, some of the things, two other things I was thinking. One was just thinking about how similar or different this was to some of the other schools and masters in other countries. I know a little bit about the Masters of Defense in England, and then through reading some of the stuff that Droga was reading about their trying to, take over the proper fight and everything. So there's probably also some additional larger context you could put it into. What were all of these fencing masters in these different cultures, really trying to do? Was it all about, money, all about trying to get their style over someone else's? And then I'm also just interested in when you said that during this time, the manuals there weren't a lot of manuals that were being written. Like I'd have to go back and look at your PowerPoint, but I'm really interested to know why. Was that because some things were coming in from Italy, so they weren't needed? Was it because this seems very, very sport focused, maybe more than in some other places, especially with the duel and the prize? So just lots of sort of questions, interesting questions right around in my brain. So thank you.
Yeah, so like I watched a presentation that like the Martinez's from New York City and like some other people from their school did on French fencing culture, and their theory was that basically the French just didn't have much of, like, they just didn't care about the written, there wasn't as much value on the written books compared to like the Italians and the manuals. But I haven't found, they didn't like cite any sources, and I haven't been able to find any. So like I'm throwing that out there in case that rings a bell and people can be like, oh yes, I heard that here. Otherwise, that's why I didn't put in the presentation, because I haven't been able to find much on that.
Like if I'm thinking about that, I would want to take a look at the culture as a whole, and I don't know that the culture as a whole is going to be different in terms of how they think about knowledge, how they teach their education system. But that's really interesting.
Yeah, I need to dive down that rabbit hole more, and I just haven't had really the time for that. To answer your question about how I've been tying this into my persona. So like I really didn't have much of I wasn't super interested in two-handers until I ran into that, and now I have my sweet two-hander I've been kind of working on over quarantine. Fortunately, we can do rapier spears now in the East Kingdom, so like that's why I have my two-headed spear, so I can practice some of the techniques that were laid out in Pascal that just as the French were doing. I'm not sure how much I can use that in an SCA, like an actual combat perspective and stuff. Like there's a lot of techniques in there that they're too big overhead and percussive kind of stuff. But at least from an ANS or persona perspective, I'm like, oh, I'm going to pick up this spear, put on two spearheads and kind of like play around with that. So it's kind of expanded my own martial arts studies by kind of seeing what my persona in Perry would have done.
Have you looked at Pasha's manuscript for the double-ended spear?
Yeah, that's the one that I was looking at. Yeah, okay. It's really cool. Yeah, I shot some videos of like some of my interpretations of the plates and text and stuff, and it's really cool.
That's the only one that I know of for the double-ended spear.
Yeah, same.
And from my understanding, that was more of a hunting. Is that correct?
Yeah, so he calls it like a hunting spear, but when he talks about the French, he really talks about using it against multiple opponents armed with swords in like an open setting and kind of stuff. But he doesn't go, his introduction is just basically one page, and I haven't been able to find a lot more into the use of that other than like a couple of blog posts and stuff. So that's definitely one of the avenues I want to kind of dive down more.
Cool.
Any other questions from our laurels? Great. Well, thank you all so much. I'm going to the spotlight. This was a really wonderful series of presentations from like a pretty wide expanse of martial knowledge, right? We talked about Japan, we talked about horses, we talked about like dueling culture, we talked about like North Africa / like the western edge of the Middle East. I'm really excited, right? Even though like my love, as I said earlier, will always be for Italian swordsmanship, I'm very excited that other people are expanding the SCA's knowledge to other areas of documentable research. I'd like to now open the floor to any questions that are like absurdly knowledgeable populace here has, right? Like looking at the people in this room who aren't our like 4-person panel of laurels, like, holy crap, is this a qualified room to ask questions of people? So I'd like to open the floor to any questions that everyone else would have of our presenters, and after, like, as a like slightly secondary, right? If our presenters have questions of the other presenters, because you all like know your own fields of research like very well, I'd love to see what you all ask of each other. So I'm going to open the floor pretty widely. For those who want to jump in, feel free. But I especially want to use the rest of this time, and I'm not really going to put like a super like specific time limit on this, right? Everything else was like in 10-minute chunks. But like, if people have questions of our presenters, I'd like to open the floor to just everyone in the room asking questions of what was presented. If you had a thing that didn't get asked by one of the laurels, if you're just wondering about like this or that resource, if you want to suggest this or that book, now is the time.
Can I just start out, because it's just fresh in my mind that I know my ADD and I'm totally going to lose it if I don't ask it quickly. It's actually a question of Remy and his presentation, because I know how the Spanish felt about that they didn't have a lot of respect for the fencing masters, even though it wasn't a position that you really aspired to. If you're going to aspire to, Carranza never became one himself, even though he only taught like 2 people, because he thought it was below him. Pacheco became the master of fence for the king, but again, that's through his courtier stuff. Even Viedma, who was a fencing master, goes into his book and talks about how little money he made and how he couldn't afford to pay a good artist to make good pictures for him. So I'm just curious about was there any respect for the fencing masters in France, or was it the same way where it was kind of more of a low tier sort of career option?
Yeah, my honest answer is I'm not sure yet. Like I said, this was a lot of like preliminary research that I've done over like the past year and stuff. I haven't found a source that really talks about how the public kind of view them. So yeah, I think that would definitely be kind of an interesting addition to the research in just terms of how were they seen and stuff. But yeah, at this point, I have no clue, unfortunately.
No worries. I was just curious whether you encountered anything, because you found so much more detail. Again, the Spanish don't talk about that sort of lowly field of being a fencing.
Anyone else have questions about swords for any of our presenters?
What?
Are you still on your roll?
Yes.
Jesus, you guys never shut up.
No.
Oh. Whoops. Sorry, I thought that was muted. Obviously not.
It's true. Truth, man.
Well, thank you. That's the best way to end this.
So I'll say this. I'll jump on what you guys were just talking about. With the Italians and the Germans, from everything I've seen, being a fencing master was kind of a side gig for a lot of them. Many of them that I've seen were professors in one way or another, and then they taught fencing on the side. For instance, I think Luca, we have documents on how much he was charging his students, and he was making enough, I think, to get by for the year, but I don't think that was his main occupation. Agrippa was a professor in the university. There's a book written, I can't remember his name, a book written by the bookkeeper for one of the Fugger families, where he documents his clothing throughout the years. But on one of his plates, he talks about when he turned 21, and he was already working for the Fuggers, he decided it was time to learn how to use the sword. So he went to school for a year or more just to learn how to use the sword. So it became kind of like a secondary thing you would do to add on to what you're already doing for your profession. So that's the way I understand it with the Italians and the Germans. I don't think they looked down on it. I think that they saw it just as something extra to do.
When you say professors, were they professors of other things, or were they professors of fence at the universities?
Well, Agrippa was a professor of, I think, architecture and science, I believe. In fact, most of Agrippa's books were on architecture. He just wrote the one on fencing. Many don't even consider him a fencing master. He just wrote his book on it. So I don't even know that he was teaching fencing either. But others, yeah. So I cannot remember where I got this, but I think there was one that was a professor of math who was a fencing master. So it varied. I have hints that others were from other professions and not even professors, but they taught fencing on the side.
Antonio De Luca was a fencing master at the University of Bologna in the mid-15th century.
So was he a teacher of fencing at the university?
No, he was a teacher of math.
Okay, that's the one then. Yeah, that's what I'm thinking about.
Droga. I'm curious, you talked about they're looking down, the Spaniards looking down on the fencing masters, and I live about 200 years ahead of most of you guys for a lot of these things, but when we start to look at some of the riding manuals that were made and some of the cooking manuals and the serving manuals that came out in about the 15th century, a lot of times those were targeted not only at the sons of the nobility who would have had access to that information directly, but they were targeted at the rising middle class. Do you think that comes into play at all into the Spaniards' attitude as you start to look at it to the later 16th century?
That would be my thought. Actually, I think you kind of nailed it, because the people who are writing this are writing it for the nobles in a lot of ways. And there's a great dissertation I'm still working my way through by Mary Dill Curtis. And she actually goes into the idea is that Carranza was really trying to get across, where he was really trying to raise the art. It's the new knighthood, essentially. And he was really trying to raise the art to a higher level by introducing all of the complexity to it, and really making it, adding a philosophy to it as well, and talking about it in the classic dialogue. So that's who he's writing to. But Carranza was kind of a classic Renaissance man himself. He wanted to be a courtier. He ended up being a governor. He was a commander in the military. So honestly, being a fencing master and earning your way by teaching fencing really was below him based on what his aspirations for nobility are. And I think that probably carried over into a lot of the stuff. I don't necessarily know what Pacheco has said about the profession, but as I said, Viedma, who wrote a fencing manual on teaching, talked about how little money he made doing it. And I think that's because it was kind of a working man's job. I've heard various conversation and read different things about who they're actually teaching. And in the most case, from what I can tell, they're teaching nobles or wannabe nobles, or the hidalgos, the lower class. But I've heard from other people, I forget who it was, I think it might've been, I don't know whether it's Tone Pui or somebody had made made a thought process that because of the hours of operation of the fencing schools, and where they talked about how they did it after hours, their analogy and the conclusion that they drew was that, well, they're teaching the average man too. They're not just teaching the nobles. I don't know who they're teaching, but I know that at least the people writing the books are saying how little they're earning, and if the people above that who are writing philosophies are saying that they're that they don't want to do that.
You can expect.
Sorry,
go for it, Michael.
I was going to add that I know that in England we see something similar. I'm thinking of like Saviolo, and when the Italian masters start to teach in places like Blackfriars, they are not exclusively teaching the sons of nobility or nobility, but there are these kind of like after hours, like discount classes where they are teaching the up and coming merchant middle class who want to learn this kind of aspirational behavior, which it falls into line of a long tradition of humans aspiring to the to be perceived as a higher class than they actually are. So I think that that's a pretty clear pattern.
But note that. So Saviolo and Rocco Benetti was catching shit from the Masters of Defense because they were taking all the rich people and teaching them the Italian style. So in London specifically, you had this interesting divide between the Masters of Defense, who were teaching the working level people, and then them bitching about the Italians, who had the coats of arms of all of their students on their walls, you know, and were teaching the nobility. Teaching them in Italian is also my thought, because most of the English courts spoke Italian. So you've got that divide: Masters of Defense doing one, the Italian masters doing the other. And I'll also draw your attention to Remy's presentation, which he didn't say, but there was a line that said you have to be well dressed in order to fence.
Mm-hmm.
And so I would even say that was trying to cut out the lower class and to keep them from coming into the fencing styles.
Mm-hmm. I think there's also an interesting through line in a couple presentations, Daroga's, Remy's, Miguel's, about the kind of like ethno-exceptionalism that a lot of these traditions are working within, and using the superiority of your sword over another style of sword from another place as evidence of your nation or ethnic group's superiority as well. And what's interesting to me and kind of funny as a modern person looking back on that time is how in places like Spain, the straight sword is considered this clear technological advancement over the curved sword that can only cut downward. And meanwhile, in England, you get people like Silver who are arguing belligerently kind of in the opposite direction, that like the good native English short basket sword or whatever is clearly superior to this weak, thin, continental sword. And I'm thinking in particular of like post-period sources in which British officers and things like the Napoleonic era are writing about their duels with French officers and how they would draw their, you know, lusty, thick hangers to go against French small swords. And there just seems to be this kind of constant back and forth about our swords are better than your swords. And it's really interesting to see that in Spain, in Poland, France was trying to limit the Italians who could teach. You know, there's a lot of that. It seems like a lot of these different groups were trying to do the same things.
I mean, at one point, Puck and Mary, I was working with them a little bit. They were going to try and translate the Pacquiao's book about dissing all the other fencing masters. And I would love to see that in English, because it really is. UT has a copy, and I've looked through it, and he really does just cut down every published fencing master that we're aware of, and it's hilarious.
There's a question from the comments, like the written comments, most specifically aimed at Elsie, although I know at least one other person in the room who can help. Are there any breeds of horse you would recommend for Rossfechten?
So there's a bunch of answers to that, depending what your goals are. There are tombs of things written about horse types. Breeds as we think of them modernly are kind of a Victorian concept, but horse types, there's a lot of period manuals that go into a great deal about that. And that sort of information is actually contemporaneous with a lot of the fight books that we have that have mounted material. So that fits in a little bit better time-wise. Personally, if you're going to go out and you're going to do Rossfechten in the SCA and you want to just go out and play, I would get something super steady and flat moving like that mule that I showed you. He's a lot easier to ride. You're going to be able to focus in a lot more on doing what you do. That big red horse, he's too big for the sport by probably about 6 inches at the shoulder. He is amazingly athletic, and I love that about him. He's also bred to trot, not to canter, which is one of the reasons we work so hard on these things. So, you know, the short answer is, oh, you just go out and buy an Andalusian or a Lusitano and it's easy, right? But the reality is something that's nice and small and steady, like a quarter horse, and is going to listen and have a good amount of steady rhythm, is going to help you most of the time. If you can go out and buy a Grand Prix dressage horse that already has a terre-à-terre, so much easier.
Can you define every single term you just used? Because I know none of them. You like trot and something else and like, I don't know.
So to give you some context, Markham published late 16th, early 17th century, and he described breeds of horses. And in there, he talks about light coach horses. So the sorts of things that you guys think about a vehicle about the size of a stagecoach. And he talks about the fine English geldings. That's actually what Moose is most similar to. In terms of period type, he's really designed to cover some ground and go out and be a hunting horse. He's not really designed for the collection that I'm asking for him. But yeah, there's a lot of jargon in my sport.
I assume this room does not know what a gelding is.
I try. So looking at the different types of horses are out there and looking at what you want in type. If you guys have ever had a chance to see the modern American quarter horse, which is what would be used in rodeo and that sort of thing, that is probably about the right size and type for a common type fighting horse. The other end of the spectrum would be some of the Spanish horses with the long flowing manes and tail, particularly as you start to get into the 17th and the 18th century. We get a lot of the influence of the Baroque that's carried through to modern day, but getting all the way back into the Renaissance is a little bit tougher in terms of breed. Does that help?
Yes.
Also, just jumping back to when people were talking about like the different, like Jaroga's question, hearing him answer basically the same question, he actually jogged a couple of things that kind of jumped into mind. So like by Louis XIV, he like made a handful of the fencing masters nobility. Louis XIII had a decree that kind of like praising the quality of the French fencing masters, saying that everyone wants a French fencing master, not an Italian now, which I'm not sure how much that is true versus maybe just PR or whatever. But the fact that like Louis XIV like made some into nobility, I think, showed that at least a certain level of respect and appreciation for what they were doing and stuff. But before that, more an SCA period, I'm not entirely sure. But you answered your question, reminding me that I could answer your question too a little bit.
Did those come with pieces of land, or were they like the equivalents of a landless court baron?
Unsure. They might, off the top of my head, it might say in the book if they got anything, but I'd have to go grab it and flip through.
All right, I am out. I've got to go.
Well, Aaron, thank you so much for dropping by and giving us your wonderful feedback. It was a pleasure to have your company.
This is fantastic. You guys all did great. And you know, take Lissa's advice on how to present. She's absolutely spot on all the things she said. And otherwise, I could sit and talk here for hours on this, but I've got some things I got to get done. So, ciao, everybody.
Yeah, and congratulations to your wife as well.
Oh, thank you. Yeah, I'll tell her.
I'm going to bow out as well. I really appreciate you running this, Raphael. Again, this has been a wonderful experience, and we just really appreciate you running this. And thank you to all of the Laurels for taking the time out of your days in order to do this and judge us and give us feedback and help us improve our arts. And thank you to the other competitors as well, because I learned a bunch of crap. Thank you.
Yeah, it's great. Thanks a lot.
Great, thanks, Daroga.
No one's judging you, Daroga.
Hi, everybody. Thank you so much. Thank you, Lord.
My only quick thought would be if you wanted to give at least my information out to anybody, I can give any feedback or thoughts within kind of my area of expertise. I don't know if the others are willing to do that, but feel free to send my email to whoever.
If you want to post that to the event page,
I can do that.
great.
I will do that.
I don't have to remember to do it.
Bye.
Bye.
I'm gonna go as well, if there's nobody else has anything. Thanks for putting it on. Everybody did great. Good job, everybody. Take care.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Logos.
Try to stay sorting. I can't, but you know. Good luck to everybody else.
Cool. Thank you so much. Bye. We have one presenter left. Does anyone have any questions?
Yeah, I wanted to wait just in case anyone had questions.
Literally the first presenter, so it all took us a while to remember the difference between gaining and finding.
I know, I felt a little badly. I went really hard in the paint as the first presenter.
No, I thought you did great.
Actually, Ishmael,
Yeah.
I actually just wanted to thank you. I liked your presentation. I am a scholar in the Academy d'Espé from many, many years ago before I moved to the West. And one of the things I liked about your presentation, because engagement is so fast in Rossfecton, there is no, oh, I'm going to lay my blade here and do 5 complicated moves. You maybe get a chance to do 2 things.
Mm-hmm.
So what I liked about yours is the idea of sort of setting up a pre-defense, as well as the concept of using position for defense. It was actually useful. Thank you.
Awesome. Yeah, it's mostly something that I see as being a common place where we maybe oversimplify a distinction that we wind up having to unteach later. At least that's been my experience. And so avoiding that, I think, is crucial. As there's been a lot of conversation recently about how we teach rapier in the SCA and about how we could do it better. And so I think one of the key things we can do is avoid giving information to our students that is so simplified because we think we're doing them a favor that we actually teach them something that is bad. Yes, I wanted to hang out in case there were any other questions, but looks like maybe not.
I know definitely like there's certain aspects, especially Fabris hates blade contact, that like creating that distinction from the get-go can be very helpful. I definitely know places where their MO is have blade contact for like levels 1 through 2, levels 3 through 4, maybe have blade contact. But I think definitely like pedagogically, it's an interesting choice of like presenting that at stage 1.
Yeah.
What they call their ranks.
Yeah, I'm gonna try it out and see what happens, because I know that, at least from my personal experience, as somebody learning rapier, I struggled really hard to understand why they were suggesting no blade contact. All the masters, Fabris, Capoferro, everyone, Giganti, and how I could still do all the defense that I thought I had learned without using blade contact. And so really I struggled uphill to unlearn the way that I was trying to defend myself. And I found that this particular paradigm helped me to understand it better. So hopefully it helps some other people too.
If you want to send me that, like any like the written stuff you have, or like what you wrote up, that would be dandy for my own like teaching purposes.
Sure.
Or as like you didn't have like a PowerPoint, but like if you have like your notes as supposed to like read all of Capoferro.
No, it's just specific parts. Yeah, I'll polish my notes a little bit for distribution and then send them to you.
Cool, that'd be great. Apparently I need to adjust the settings on this Facebook event, but if you want to like post, once I figure that out, once you want to post it to there.
Sure, we'll do.
Cool.
All right.
Does anyone else left have any questions for Elsie or Ishmael? You can have questions for each other, it's fine.
I was super interested in the like Rossfecton, the idea of using the horse's actual rhythm to create power. I think that was like really fascinating. And particularly, I guess I hadn't really considered just how much a horse has to be trained for that particular task. So I guess the question that I would have is, does it seem like from the manuals that you read, Elsie, that you had a horse that was prepared for combat and a horse that was prepared for like civilian riding or farm tasks? Is it that's that specialized? Like you would not take the random horse that you were riding to and from and try to teach it to do this task because of how special it was?
Yeah, you wouldn't haul your event trailer to an event with your Ferrari. You know, it's particularly as you start to get to the upper levels, right? We're talking about the knightly class, and the horses were material good as much as anything. And when you look at the start of the riding masters, a lot of times they were horse trainers. They certainly taught people how to ride as well, and we have a lot of documentation for that. But each horse had a different role because they covered every transportation need that's covered with an engine now was covered by a horse or a donkey or a mule or an ox. So it's one of the things we get wrong in the SCA because we can't afford to own a full stable of horses. You know, my Viscounty doesn't cover that somehow. But so I make do with the horse that I have, even when he's not ideal for all the activities that I do with him. But they were very, very specially trained. They do, even Grissoni makes the difference between kind of the minimum level of training, you know, that would kind of be your budget level cheap sword, versus the very high-end, best of the best horses. And when you think back to tournament culture, it starts to make sense on why it's worth ransoming someone's horse and someone's armor. They were worth the modern, a high-end tournament horse would have been worth the modern equivalent of $100,000.
I guess, and that like my follow-up question to that would be, does it seem like there are situations where a superior swordsman can actually lose their life or injury because the opponent, who maybe was an inferior swordsman, had a superiorly trained horse?
I think, you know, my understanding from reading what the good horsemen have written, as well as from the experiences what we've done, a good rider beats a good swordsman every day. Because, you know, footwork. So I think the difference in terms of training is if you have a breakdown in the horse's attitude, you know, if the horse spooks, does something dumb, then that's going to put anyone, regardless of skill, at risk. But I don't see, well, okay, if I go back to some of the Spanish, this is from the joust. So this is, you know, running straight at each other a la Knight's Tale. They do actually make some allowances because sometimes they were on borrowed horses. So they do actually make allowances in some of those accounts for the level of horse, as well as for the, if you had a horse that misbehaved, they would go back and they would allow a reride for that within sport. I haven't seen as many accounts in, say, war.
That's fascinating.
Do you know how many horses people in Western Europe would show up to battle with? So for reference, I have a minor in East Asian history. So I have like references in like the Mongols and the Huns, but like, so I know that like the horse to human ratio was like pretty skewed towards the horses. I'm just wondering as to how many horses Western European knights / chivalry / people who could afford horses showed up with.
So there are some fantastic accounts, which I can't quote to you off the top of my head, but I can speak generally. I'm actually working on an event on the 15th century travel right now. A portion of that is not all of those were war horses. You know, they're gonna travel with, they're gonna have their riding horse, their traveling horse, which may also be their hunting horse as well, to go out and chase game. They're also gonna have quite a few pack horses that are going to travel along, and you may or may not have had mounted retainers, depending on relative wealth. Depending on where you are in Europe will make a difference on whether you had vehicles. You tend to see, as you start to get into Eastern Europe, vehicles seem to be more common and more widely used earlier. You start getting in towards France and England, very generically, packed trains seem to be used more commonly. So that's some of where those numbers come from. There's some question. It was a great presentation at Leeds that was actually talking about some of the accounts of how many Arabs there were, the horses, in some of the battles in North Africa. And I wish I could remember now who the presenter was, but she was speaking and thinking that maybe some of those numbers were inflated within the account related to the sales, but we're getting way out into my memory on that one.
All right, I am going to head out. Thank you so much, Raphael, for organizing this. This was really cool and inspirational.
Oh, my pleasure. Thank you so much for presenting and like putting yourself out there. I just had to admit a bunch, so like my job was easy.
Awesome.
We all did the hard work.
Cool.
Thank you so much.
Welcome. Cool. With that, call it. Thank you all so much for coming out. For anyone watching this afterwards, hope you enjoyed the recording. Have a great day. Bye.